I really wasn't planning on telling this story, but it's been a few years and I'm not as freaked out by what happened as I used to be, so why not? I was only 19 at the time. I had moved across the country the year before college and had never had any issues driving home for the different breaks that we had over the school year. It was winter break, and my mom really wanted me to come home that year to celebrate the holidays with my family. Since I hadn't that year before, I agreed, but I really didn't want to leave my car for weeks. There had been a lot of car break-ins in the city that I lived in, and leaving my cart to be vandalized, broken into, or stolen just was not an option to me. It told my mom that I'd been driving home and she wasn't too happy about it, but understood she offered to have my dad fly out and drive with me. But I didn't want them to go through all that trouble. And I thought a few days on the road by myself would be a good thing. I'd been having issues in my personal life, and having the time to think about it without any distractions seemed like a good thing. I packed up a few bags that wouldn't last, met the next few weeks, and said goodbye to my roomma. I was pretty bummed out about me leaving. I headed out the door looking back on it. Now, my car probably wasn't worth what I went through during that drive home. It was a 20-year-old Honda Civic that had the propensity to break down a lot and buy a lot. I mean, at least once a month. I just didn't have the money to replace it. I hopped in the car and was on the highway within a few minutes. I got some coffee before heading out of the city, so I could stay awake as long as possible. It was still around 8 in the morning, so I figured I'd drive for around 10 hours before hopefully finding a hotel and settling in for the night. I had no definite plans and was following the fastest route home, which probably wasn't the best decision. I know now that I should have taken the route that didn't involve long stretches of highway with nothing but feld for miles and miles. I stopped a few times for bathroom and snack breaks, and by around 7:00 p.m., I was done. I'd been driving for almost 11 hours and didn't want to be a hazard to myself or others on the road if I kept driving while being that exhausted. I found a relatively nice hotel and got a room for the night, planning to continue my drive the next morning that day. I'd been driving through parts of the Midwest, and it wasn't necessarily something I was looking forward to the last time I drove through. It was a lot of just flat land and cornfields, both things I thought were boring to look at on a long road trip. It was winter, so there was no corn the weather. Could have been better, but I had no issues the day before, so I hoped that it would stay that way. The day went by faster than the previous one, and the sun was down before I knew it by 6 p.m. I was feeling pretty good to keep going, so I passed through the next city and drove on around 700. I started hearing a knocking sound and I wanted to cry when I realized that it was coming from my engine, and it started to snow. My car began to creep along the road until I pulled to the side of the road where it completely gave out. It was getting cold without the heater on, and I knew that I had to get help very soon. I checked Google Maps to see if I was close to another city, but the next town, albeit every small one, was still almost an hour away. It tried calling my parents to tell them what happened, but my service was completely out. I decided to use the emergency calls only button on my phone to call for help. And thank God it worked. The only problem was the closest officer that could respond was at least an hour away in the town that I mentioned earlier. It told the dispatcher that obviously it'd wait, and she instructed me to lock the doors and try to hide myself inside the car enough to where it looked as though Noon was inside, apparently. Right, where my car decided to die on me also happened to be every sketchy section of the highway. That wasn't very safe for stranded drivers, especially young women. I'm not going to lie, having the dispatcher tell me that made me feel physically ill. It felt like I was going to have a fast. My heart was racing. I put up a sun shield in the windshield area and thankfully had 3 extra ones in the car from when I went car camping. I decided to put those along the sides and back windshield as well so Noon could see inside from the outside. It would look almost black around 30 minutes into me waiting. I started getting the feeling like somebody. Us watching me now, I tried convincing myself that it was just because of the situation that I was in and that all the windows were covered anyway. So there was no way that was possible. I wanted to shake it off, but the feeling just wouldn't go away. No matter how much it told myself that it was okay, there was something inside him telling meth in the situation I wasn't about to get very, very scary. It turned on the screen on my phone and faced it in the direction of the windows. Not knowing what I was about to see would traumatize me for years to come at first. I felt some ease seen. Gonly, the reflection of the sun shield, it turned my phone towards the passenger side windows, and in the small crack that wasn't covered, to my horror, A strip of window was visible on the other side of the window was the face of a man pressed against the glass with a smile, staring directly at. Man, my first reaction was this blood-curdling scream. It was a sound that I didn't know that I even had the ability to make. It was like fear itself was manifesting in sound. It almost actually ranged in my ears. The second the scream left my mouth, I watched as the man lifted his face from the glass. Sand heard him begin to laugh the most full guttural laugh I'd ever heard immediately. I heard the car move as the man violently tried the door handle to get access into my car. I was screaming and crying as she hurled himself around the car, howling like it was some animal between his laughing. It felt like he was taunting me in a way. I called 911 again and was screaming that it needed help. Now, the woman who answered the second time wasn't as friendly as the first. I'd spoken to only 30 minutes prior. She kept yelling at me to stop screaming. Otherwise, she woo, LDant Beeble to help me. I was crying, trying my best to calm down as the man just outside my car was putting me through this. She hung up on me, and I felt completely helpless. The only relief that I was feeling at the moment was the fact that they hadn't been able to break into my car. I called 911 again, hoping I'd get a dispatcher with more empathy, and thankfully, that was the case. A man answered and immediately took my distress into account and helped me calm down enough to get the information he needed. The officer had been sent almost 45 minutes before. Now, was only around 10 minutes away. I was told that they'd have him get to me as quickly as possible. Given what I was going through, I was hopeful, but that hope was ripped away when I heard the sound of what was obviously a rock being thrown at my windshield. It's hattered just to motivate the man to get on top of my hood and start stomping the windshield until it was broken enough for him to reach a hand inside, screamed and climbed into the back seat. I was trying my best to get out of reach of this very insane and clearly dangerous person. They started tearing the windshield out of the way, and his face was even scarier than it was the first time. Izod, I was paralyzed with fear as I watched him begin to climb between the glass into the car. I had no choice but to get out of the car and hope the officer was close by. I opened the door and turned on my phone's flashlight. If aced it toward the hood and was sore relieved to see that he had become stuck. He was trying to climb out, but wasn't able to. It then saw the beautiful flashing red and blue lights in the distance and heard the sirens as she drove closer. It started frantically waving him due. When Andhep pulled up beside me, he was out of his care in seconds, and another police car was pulling up behind him. Only a few minutes later, I was placed in one of the cop cars and watched as they actually drew their guns out, demanding that the man climb out of the cart. This crazy guy was screaming and thrashing his body around. One of the officers grabbed him by the ankles and pulled him out of the vehicle. The man tried biting him multiple times before being slammed to the ground and handcuffed. They put him in the back of the other car and told member officers would be coming down. To take pictures of the scene, and a tow truck would be on its way to my car. I was driven to the police station and gave my statement about everything that happened. I called my parents, who bought me plane ticket home from the nearest airport, which the officers were nice enough to drive me to. I wish I could tell you the man who did that to me and even give areas on as to why, but hadn't. He was somethingly deranged that they said he wasn't even fit to stand trial. Eventually, I guess she was taken to some state mental hospital where the last I heard he's still there. I wish that here was some justice for the hell that it put me through, and maybe some people would say there was, but it wasn't. Justice isn't being punished. The memory of what happened punishes me every day. It's gotten easier to deal with as time goes by, but it'll always be there to torture me anytime I'm reminded of that man in the window. I was driving my truck back home from my girlfriend's apartment. It was a stormy night with heavy rain and darkness enveloping the town despite the adverse weather conditions. I wasn't too concerned after all. My house was only a 10-minute drive away, and I had to work early the next day. All my work clothes were at my places, so I had no choice but to brave the storm. The power had gone out, leaving the streets in completed darkness. The only source of illumination was my truck's headlights casting a eerie glow on the rains road ahead. The relentless downpour pounded on my windshield, and my rears struggled to keep up, making it feel like I was driving blind. Yet I knew these streets like the back of my hand. Muscle memory guided my turns and calculated distances as I navigated the familiar route. It turned onto the road that led to my house, but almost immediately a sense of unease crept over me. Something wasn't right. It felt as though my truck was floating, and I sensed moisture creeping in around my feet inside the cab. The lights flickered ominously. I peered out and through my headlights. I could see the water outside. Rising steadily, panic began to set in as my truck was slowly consumed by the encroaching flood. The current tugged at my vehicle, dragging it further into the watery abyss. Frantically, I unbuckled my seatbelt and attempted to open the driver's side door, but it wouldn't yield. Water was now seeping in, rapidly reaching my knees. I remembered my father's advice about not panicking in life-threatening situations. Taking deep breaths, I reached for a waterproof flashlight in my glove box with trembling hands. It turned it and scanning the dark interior for something to be. React the window. Unfortunately, I had recently cleaned out the truck and left my tools behind. All I had was my sweater, the small flashlight, and a pocket knife. Desperation compelled me to dial 911. However, I was greeted with a recorded message informing me that all dispatchers were occupied with other calls due to the storm. The voice assured me that they would respond as soon as possible. The dispatcher's indifference only fueled my fear. Time was slipping away as the water continued to rise. The water level had now reached my belly button, and I was rapidly osing, hope squatting on my seat. I struggled to keep my head above water. It was clear that most of the water was seeping in from the driver's side door. I grabbed my sweater and tried to use it as a makeshift barrier, but it proved futile. 7 agonizing minutes later, a dispatcher finally answered. I relayed my duress situation, but they offered little comfort. They explained that many others were also trapped in flooding situations, and it would take at least 30 minutes for help to arrive. I pleaded for them to stay on the line, but they cited the overwhelming demand for dispatchers during the storm and advised me to call back if the situation worsened. I hung up, realizing that I couldn't afford to wait another 7 minutes if things deteriorated further. Panic surged as the water reached my chest. My pleas to my parents went unanswered as I continued to record my voice messages, my shaky words filled with a mixture of desperation and resignation. Only 10 minutes after my call on, the water had climbed to my neck, and I was convinced that my time was running out. With my cheek pressed against the roof, tears streamed down my face. Noon was coming to my rescue, and despair gripped me suddenly. The sound of an approaching engine broke through my despair. I hadn't expected anyone to notice my stranded truck in the darkness, but I screamed and flashed my light to draw their attention. Relief flooded over me as a boat pulled up alongside my truck. I directed my flashlight towards the person who jumped into the water next to my driver's side window. They had a window breaker and shattered it in their first attempt, grabbing hold of my shirt. They pulled me out through the window. I guess Pedv. Oreras, they hoisted me onto the boat, overwhelmed with gratitude. I thanked them profusely for saving my life. As it took deep, shuddering breaths, an emergency blanket was wrapped around me, providing a much-needed sense of warmth and security. We continued to rescue others strapped in their vehicles before finally reaching an area where police and firefighters were waiting. I was transported to a hospital, but fortunately I didn't have any serious medical issues. I felt immensely thankful to be alive. It was a harrowing experience, and I had come dangerously close to becoming a tragic statistic. The incident left me deeply disillusioned with my city's emergency services. On that fateful night, it was Good Samaritans, not law enforcement, who had come to my aid. I hoped that none else would ever find themselves in the same dire situation, but if they did, I prayed that someone would rescue them in time, just as I had been saved that night in the months that followed. I battled nightmares of drowning. Even now, it felt a shiver off fear whenever I had to drive in a storm or venture out on deep water. I had attempted the Rappi a few times, but it hadn't provided the solace I needed, so I had eventually stopped. I longed for the day when I could finally move on from that traumatic night and banish its haunting memory from my life. I was grateful to be alive, but the scars ran deep, reminding me of the night I had come so close to losing everything. I had just completed a grueling 24 hours shift in construction and management. My workplace had no qualms about overworking us when deadlines loomed, and the promise of overtime pay of 10 kept us going. As I drove home from the job site, the clock was nearing 3 in the morning, and the road was empty, save for the occasional set of headlights in the distance. The exhaustion was taking its toll on, meaned I knew I was being reckless by attempting to drive in such a state. Nevertheless, all I craved was my bed, and I pushed on during the drive. My eyelids drooped dangerously several times, almost causing me to veer off the road. Just as my wariness seemed insurmountable, a chilling sight snapped me awake there on the side of the deserted roads. At a young girl no older than 7 or 8, I initially passed her by, but nagging feeling in my gut prompted me to turn my car around and check if she needed help. I pulled up beside her, and her gaze met mine. Here shelled a peculiar, unsettling intensity. I asked if she was okay or needed assistance, but she remained silent. Their lips sealed tightly. My sense of unease grew stronger, and I reassured her that it meant there no harm coaxing her to get into my car. She hesitated for a moment before finally complying. My plan was to take her to the nearest police station, hoping they could identify her and reunite her with her family. I made countless attempts to elicit information from her during the drive, but she remained mute, fixated on me with those unnerving eyes. The silence in the car was deafening as we continued down the dark, desolate road for another 10 minutes. Then, unbelievably, it happened again. I spotted another child, this time a little boy city. Gone to the side of the road, he too refused to speak and without hesitation climbed into my car. I repeated my questions, but he responded with the same eerie silence, his gaze mirroring the girl's locked onto me. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had unwittingly stumbled into something's. In Ister were these children kidnapped and abandoned? Here was it some horrifying trafficking situation, or had they simply become lost? The questions whirled in my mind and answered another. 15 agonizing minutes passed, and my worst fears were realized when I saw a car seat on the side of the road. I pulled over and with trepidation got out of my cart. To my horror, our little baby was nestled inside, its age unclear but seemingly healthy. Its innocent eyes met mine, and I knew I couldn't leave it there. I placed the car seat in the back of my car and dialed the police immediately. Relief washing over me as I got a signal. They instructed me to go to the nearby hospital, and they promised to meet me. I arrived at the hospital shortly after the call and carried the car seat inside, beckoning the children to follow there. Receptionist was the only person there, and I frantically explained the situation to my bewilderment. Their response was a puzzled and confused expression. I motioned for the children to stand beside her, imploring her to help, but she seemed oblivious to their presence. My frustration mounted as she repeatedly asked if I was okay, completely ignoring the children and the baby in the car seat. I couldn't fathom why she couldn't see, more why she was so intent on my well-being, when it was the children who needed assistance. As I was recounting the story to the receptionist, 2 police officers entered the hospital. It told them the same bewildering tale, but they too were unable to see the children standing right in front of them. I was utterly perplexed and growing desperate as they concluded that there were not children with me. Instead, they believed I was experiencing some form of mental episode. I protested, insisting that I had never had any mental health issues, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. I was admitted to the hospital under a 72-hour observation cycle due to my persistent hallucinations, as they deemed me potential Dan. To myself and others, their certainty was disconcerting, and I was convinced that they were the ones who were delusional over the next few days. I underwent numerous tests and evaluations to uncover the root of my bizarre experiences. Initially, they attributed it to severe sleep deprivation, a common cause of hallucinations. However, even after hours of sleep, the hallucinations persisted, raising suspicions of a deeper issue. I was scared and felt trapped in a nightmarish world, desperate for answers. I called my mother, who came to the hospital and provided our family's medical history to the doctors. After the 72 hours lapsed, I decided to stay at the hospital as I had another explanation for what was happening to me in the following weeks. The children continued to follow me everywhere they watched Ms. Leap, providing a strange comfort, but also serving as a constant reminder that something was profoundly wrong with me. The hallucinations, however, were no longer my sole concern. I began to experience speech difficulties and struggled to think clearly further, perplexing the doctors. This cognitive decline impeded further investigation, and during an MRI, one attentive doctor noticed a shadow. It turned out that I had a small but malignant frontal lobe tumor compressing the optic nerve. Regrettably, its proximity to the optic nerve ruled out surgical removal. Nevertheless, the doctors remained hopeful that chemotherapy and radiation could combat the cancer cells, given that it had been detected at an early stage. I embarked on a course of chemotherapy and radiation, and as the weeks passed, the hallucinations diminished. In frequency, part of me began to miss their press, and ceased. They had become strangely familiar companions. Most importantly, they had led me to the hospital where my life-threatening condition was discovered early. I'm still undergoing treatment, and while my official prognosis remains uncertain, I choose to hold on to hope. Without the eerie encounter on that fateful night, I might have never sought medical attention, and my life could have taken a much darker turn. Hope is my constant companion now, a beacon guiding me through the uncertainty that lies ahead. I drive part-time for Uber Eats as a college student, and it's a great gig that I can work around my school schedule. This eerie incident occurred one night after my classes, probably around 11 p.m. I didn't have class until late in the afternoon the next day, so I decided to stay up late and complete as many food deliveries as I could. I received an unusual grocery order to pick up from a 7-Eleven and deliver to an address about 15 minutes away. The directions led me through a few neighborhoods, so eventually taking me to the back roads that led to a densely wooded area. As I approached the end of a gravel road, I glanced at the address on the app, which indicated that it was down this path. However, all I could see were safety cones and construction materials, with no streetlights to illuminate the way with caution. I ventured down the path, switching on my brights and carefully maneuvering through the obstacles until I reached the last turn. This section was even more unsettling, resembling a path more than a road. I consulted the map again, and it was clear that the address was indeed at the end of this mysterious path. I raised my head peering into the darkness ahead. As my eyes adjusted, it started to discern a structure at the end of the path. It looked somewhat like a house, but there was an undeniable, eerie quality about it. My senses sting-led with unease, and as I scanned my surroundings, I began to make out more houses in the vicinity. The limited light from my headlights prevented me from seeing them clearly, but it appeared to be a community of newly built houses under construction. Considering this, I reasoned that the house marked on my GPS might be one of the few completed ones. It turned and proceeded down the path, pulling into an empty cul-de-sac with a lone house. Up close, it was apparent that the house was not entirely finished, although the front appeared nearly done complete with. A door to spit the bizarre situation, I reminded myself that my job was simply to deliver the groceries and not to concern myself with someone else's housing situation. I parked my car, retrieved the grocery bags, and approached the front door. All the lights were off and a Neary's Islands invalid area, making me increasingly uneasy. Placing the bags on the doorstep, I knocked, but there was no response. As it turned to make my way back to the cars, something caught my peripheral vision in the shadows near the edge of the woods. As all movement, my heart skipped a beat and afar. Oza for a moment, staring into the dark abyss. Whatever it was had ceased moving. Panic surged through merging, made a hurry back to my car. I reached the vehicle, started the engine, and as my headlights pierced the darkness, Izuaman, standing exactly where I had seen the movement in the woods. His eyes were locked on to me, his gaze intense and unsettling without taking my eyes off him. It started to back out, but my anxiety had me gripping the wheel too tightly. I barely noticed as my car jolted backward, first at their rear tires, then at the front. The entire vehicle rocked violent. Life for a moment, my adrenaline surged, preventing me from getting a good look at what had caused the disturbance. I hit the gas harder, getting off the path and onto the gravel road. As I entered the normal neighborhood, it became evident that my car was shaking and bumping, and there was no doubt I had several flat irons and managed to pull over somewhere. I felt safer and immediately called the police. They conducted a search of the address and the Uber Eats account, only to find that the address led to an unfinished, uninhabited property, and the account itself was a throwaway. The police did discover several Argus Harpen metal objects on the path, likely placed. After I had pulled in a sand attempt to immobilize me, what the intentions of those individuals were, once they had me trapped out there in the woods, remains a mystery. Perhaps they aimed to rob me or worse, but I was grateful I didn't have to find out. I was 17 years old and had just gotten my driver's license. Looking back, admit I was the typical self-absorbed teenager too, impatient and reckless for my own good. It was a Friday night, and I was desperately trying to persuade my mom to let me take the cart, meet up with my friends. She, on the other hand, was adamant about not letting me convinced that I was planning to go out drinking and drive under the influence. I kept reassuring her that I had no intention of doing anything like that, but she remained unwavering in her decision. In a fit of frustration, I uttered the words I would later come to regret. "I hate you," slamming the door to my room. I resolved to sneak out later that night around 11 p.m. With my mom asleep in her bed and my dad out of town. I figured it would be easy to make my escape earlier in the night. I had already swiped the car keys so stealthily as I could. I crawled out of my window and onto the front lawn. My mom had forced me to install Life 360 on my phone at decision. I now wish I had never agreed to avoid her tracking my location. It turned off the app, thinking I could fool her if she happened to notice I was gone. She was the type of mom who would call the police if I didn't return. When I was supposed to, I sent a quick text to my friends asking where they were, and predictably, they had driven all the way to Lade Spite, being over an hour away from their location, and made the foolish decision to go after them. The traffic on the freeway was unbearable, so I decided to take some side street shopping for a faster route. Living in Southern California meant ton thing for sure traffic everywhere all the time. As I continued driving, I became increasingly lost, refusing to turn on my phone for directions. I sought to reach a freeway, hoping it would lead me back home. Time slipped away, and the later it got, the more disoriented. I felt I had to admit to myself I was scared, and all I really wanted was my mom. I meandered through cider roads, alleys, and sketchy neighborhoods, not giving a thought to my own safety. Then I turned down a narrow road and was met with a shock truck, blocking my path, parked sideways, a sieve. Deliberately, when I attempted to reverse, a man suddenly appeared, pointing a gun at my face and pounding on my window. Panic coursed through me, and I did as she instructed. He ordered me out of the car and shoved me to the ground. Another man rushed over and started kicking me relentlessly, each bull, feeling like it might rupture my stomach. I begged them to stop screaming for help, but a few others just stood by watching. The assault leading, the utterly helpless. All I wished for was my dad to miraculously appear and save me. I knew it was impossible, but the thought of seeing my parents again was the only glimmer of hope I had. The beating seemed endless, and I realized they believed I had passed out, though. I hadn't. I lay motionless, my arms shielding my head and face. That was when one of them got the horrifying idea to stomp on my face. As soon as my arms moved, his foot, K. Me crashing down on my jaw in that moment, the adrenaline coursing through my body dulled the pain, but I'd come to understand later just how excruciating it truly was. Eventually, the beating ceased. I guess they thought I was unconscious, but I wasn't. I was simply incapable of moving any part of my body. Flashes of light pierced through my closed eyelids, and I realized they were taking pictures of me as if they were proud of their vicious act. They laughed as they searched my pockets, making off with my keys, wallet, and phone before driving away in my Carol. I could think of. Outwashed so much, I wished I had listened to my mom and stayed home. I lay there, the pain slowly setting in my jaw, throbbed the most. It felt broken with great effort. It managed to open my eyes in the dim light, only to see it staining the asphalt around me. I tried to lift myself up, but the agony was too intense. Tears streamed down my face as the horrifying realization washed over me. There was a significant chance it might pass right there, one on a desolate street. The last thing I had said to my mom was that I hated her, but I didn't. I just wanted to see her more than anything, to have her be my side, getting Meth the help I so desperately needed, reassuring Meth that everything would be okay. I must have lost consciousness, because the next thing I remember is paramedics waking me up asking for my name. And what had happened, I was still sprawled out on the road as they prepared to load me onto a stretcher with an ambulance nearby, waiting to take me to the nearest hospital. I could barely speak, but in managed to utter my name before blacking out once again. It seemed like an eternity before I regained consciousness in the hospital, a week having passed since at fateful night. My jaw was wired shut, the result of a stomped me face. My mom was sitting beside my hospital bed, tears streaming down her face. As I recounted the terrifying details of what I had endured, the police and doctors told me that it was likely part of some gang initiation, and that I was incredibly lucky to be alive. As they described my injuries, it became painfully clear how close I had come to losing my life. That night, multiple broken ribs, internal bleeding from relentless kicks to me, torso, a broken jaw, nose, and various other facial fractures. The Lee swash arrowing, but the most horrifying revelation was that my Achilles tendons had been severed to this day. Nobody can explain why they did that or why I hadn't felt it happen. I underwent surgery on both my ankles, and even now, it faced the prospect of more surgeries and extensive physical therapy before I could even think about walking normally again. I remained in the hospital 4 months before being allowed to return home. I couldn't help but feel foolish for my reckless decision. What had happened to me was the worst case scenario of what could occur when a teenager takes their parents' car without permission. I'm not sharing this story to make you believe that disobedience leads to such horrors. It's far from common. Instead, I hope my experience serves as a reminder that sometimes our parents do know best. They possess life experience, wisdom, and unconditional love that we should never take for granted. I'm a single mother, and I know a lot of people will roll their eyes when they read that, but it's important to the stories, so please don't judge too hard the story I'm about to tell you took place when I was in my late 30s, and my two daughters were 13 and 15. I had just gotten out of an intense custody battle with their father, but thankfully, I was awarded full custody due to his drug addiction and rocky financial status. My girls and I were so excited to be moving to another state away from all the drama the custody battle had caused. There was a lot of choosing sides and blame being thrown around, even by my daughters, so decided that getting out of such a toxic environment by moving was the best idea, for it was early June and the weather had started to warm up. We had just packed up the last boxes in our house and decided to leave a few days before the moving truck as we wanted to get settled in the house before all our stuff arrived. If there would be no furniture for a few days, we were fin with that. We said goodbye to our old house, which was every emotional thing for us to do, and we thought we were taking the fast route. And according to Google, it was only supposed to take a couple of days to get to the new house. We had the idea that we'd stay in a hotel for one night along the way, and that was super exciting for us. My girls loved staying at hotels like most kids do, and I loved seeing them happy after hours of driving. It was late afternoon, and we were ready to get out of the car and find a room to stay in. I checked every hotel in the area, every app, and there was nothing available. Literally not one room was free in any of the surrounding cities for another 3 nights. I called around and a pair, there was a huge kids soccer tournament in town, one of the largest in the country. We decided to keep driving until we found something, but instead we were met with a stretch of road that had a lot of rest stops, but no hotels. We stopped at a gas station to get some gas and noticed a few baker guys in the parking lot. As I waited at the pump, in noticed one of the men staring into the back seat of my car, clearly looking at my daughters, who were both asleep. It felt a chill run down my spine, and I instantly had this gut feeling to get him out of the RE. It just didn't seem like a great pose. I shouldn't be a young mom alone with her teenage daughters. Not great. I didn't even wait for the gas to finish pumping. It took it out, closed the gas cap, got back in the car as inconspicuous as possible, and got back on the highway. I watched to see if they were following us, but they didn't, and I thought maybe I had just been a little paranoid, so I stopped thinking about it, the girls, and I decided to stop. Terraced stop, we felt like it was safe enough. Because of the time when we pulled in, there were plenty of other vehicles and people around. I had my daughters cover the back windows, but at the blankets that we had brought with use, and we all fell asleep at around 8 p.m. I had the intention of only sleeping for a few hours before head off again, but I had failed to remember to set an alarm. Instead, I was woken up by the loud roar of a motorcycle pulling up beside the car. I don't know what it is about being a mom, but every sound I hear makes me wide awake in seconds when my daughters are around. I sat up and looked outside the window, and I was terrified to see the same men from the gas station only a few parking spots away, and they weren't alone. There were at least 25 to 30 of them. Now I was fairly positive that they hadn't seen. So I decided not to wake the girls. I didn't want to scare them. I started the car and turned on the headlights, but no matter how much it tried to pull out of the RE unnoticed, it just wasn't going to happen. Something in the universe wanted those bikers to see me car and recognize it quickly. The second my headlights switched, one every head turned and looked directly at us. I was hoping the men from the gas station wouldn't realize that they had seen use earlier. But of course that wasn't the case. I heard none of them yell out to his buddies that they knew, and that there were a couple of hotties in the back seat. I was immediately terrified, but also rolling my eyes, because who even says that, especially about 2 teenage girls who were obviously underage, but then again, they didn't seem like the kind of people who would care about that sort of thing. I honestly thought that if I just drove away, it would be like the last time where they wouldn't follow, but now they were quick to follow right behind. I woke up the girls, and I wish I could have been one of those moms who sugarcoated things to save their kids from being scared. But there was no way to do that with we. Hat was going on and told them that we were being followed by some scary men, and they stayed down where noon could see them, keeping the blankets on the windows. They both started freaking out and crying, and I understood as it sped down the highway, these bikers got more aggressive. They began throwing things at my car and swerving as they tried to run us off the road. I was trying my best to stay calm on the outside, so as not to scare the girls any more than they already were, but on the inside. I was having a full-blown panic attack. I knew my main priority had to be maintaining Kant. Roll of my carrot was clear that if something happened and they were successful in running us off the road, nothing good would come of that. They started yelling at me to just pull over, and that they only wanted to chat. I continued to stare forward outside the windshield, and Novin acknowledged them, and they didn't like that they started calling my names, demanding I rolled down my window. I roll it down about an inch to try and plead with them to just stop and leave us alone. But there was no way they could hear me. We drove like that for at least 5 miles before and tearing the next city, and by that time it was already 2. In the morning, finally, I came to my senses and told my oldest daughter to just call the police. Through tears, she told them what was going on. I don't know what they told her, but she said that they were coming. Unfortunately, it just wasn't soon enough. I felt something hit the side of the car, and within seconds, we were off the side of the road and headed for a tree. Islammed the brakes as hard as I could, and the car came to every violent halt. We were all okay. But I started to wonder for how long thought the bikers surrounded us and started pounding on the windows and pulling on the door handles while the car shook. The girls were screaming at the top of their lungs and begging me to make them go away, but there was really nothing I could do. I prayed to God that we would make it out of the re-end. Thank God he answered my prayers. We heard sirens in the distance and watched as the men got back on their motorcycles. Speeding away, we hugged each other and cried until the officers were standing at the doors of the cart. They had to step out, and we explained everything now. They tried to get in contact with the bikers around that area, but they weren't able to CK them down, specifically, at least not at that moment to this day. I'm still terrified every time I see a group of motorcyclists. My girls are older, now with children of their own, and my biggest piece of advice to them, always carry protection. You just generally never know when you're going to find yourself in a situation as psychotic as that. I grew up in a quaint little town nestled in the heart of Canada, a couple of hours' drive from Edmonton, Alberta. This charming place situated along the river that lent its name to the town was my childhood, haven for about 4 to 5 months each year. Athabasca transformed into a bona fide winter wonderland, becoming an integral part of my upbringing. Winter sports buildings now men and engaging in epic ball fights with my childhood friend were cherished. Memories Alberta was my home, and I never imagined straying too far from it the farthest. I thought I'd ever venture was down to Edmonton for work. However, fate had other plans for my family, leading us farther away from home than I could have ever imagined. My career path had taken me to Melbourne, Australia, where I and Tag girl got married and decided to build our family. Since my side of the family was more flexible with travel, they visited us in Melbourne once or twice a year, but for all those years, my children had only heard stories about their dad's homeland. And most importantly, they had never seen snow. My daughter, Angie, had turned 5, and my little boy, James, was 4 when my wife and I decided it was time to introduce them to the beauty of a Canadian winter. So we planned a trip back to Alberta for Christmas in 2018. Angie was particularly thrilled, while James seemed rather bewildered by the prospect upon landing in Edmonton and embarking on the 84-mile journey to my parents' place. My kids were utterly captivated by the pristine snow-covered landscape that enveloped us, showing them my beloved hometown was a magical experience, and they relished their time with their grandparents. However, the snow stalled the show as my children reveled in its splendor in Australia. Christmas was celebrated much like in Canada, but the glaring difference was the weather. While Northern Hemisphere countries were immersed in deep winter, the Southern Hemisphere was sweltering in high summer. It was a bizarre feeling to witness festive advertisements featuring fake snow and 40 degrees Celsius heat. I often wondered if Australians would eagerly trade their scorching weather for a day of frost just to align with the Christmas spirit. For my kids, having a snowy backdrop for Christmas was as enchanting as a trip to Disneyland, and they cherished every moment of it. The kids couldn't get enough of the snow. They want to build snow, engage in snow ball fights, and experience all the winter activities I had enjoyed as a child. Donning warm winter clothing was an exciting novelty for them. Angie once remarked that she felt like either an Eskimo or an astronaut, given how alien the experience was. Furthermore, adventure took an unexpected turn when my wife spotted an advertisement for a winter glamping experience at Jot Lodge. We eagerly booked an overnight stay in one of family-sized yurts, arriving on December 21st. We were all set to build an army of snowmen by noon. We frolic in the snow for hours, but as twilight descended, my wife retired to the yurt to prepare dinner on the provided camping stove. The kids and I continued to play in the fading light. And after an intense ball fight where my children unexpected teamed up against me, wheel grew ravenous. We were just a short distance from the yurt, so I dashed back to check on my wife, who assured me dinner would be ready soon. It then returned to the spot where my kids had been playing only to find Angie starting the base of yet another snowman. My heart pounded as I realized that James was nowhere to be seen. I initially assumed James couldn't have strayed too far, but panic surged through me when Angie looked up with concern and stammered. I don't know she seemed to fear my anger, but my overwhelm. Ingemotion was frantic terror. It knew I had to find James. And if followed his little boot prints frantically calling his name, the moments that followed were the most terrifying of my life, exacerbated by the fact that Angie was witnessing my frantic search, feeling a sense of responsibility for her little brother's disappearance. It followed James's footprints through the snow until they led me to that sent chills down my spine. An icy cold stream lay before me. It didn't appear deep or wide, but it was the perfect size for a 4-year-old to fall into and be swept away. By the current, my heart raced as I scanned the water for any sign of screaming his name in desperation, hoping he would hear and come running. My daughter watched petrified as he ran up and down the streams, banks searching for any trace of my son's body in the water. These moments were excruciating. The fear of losing my child consuming me. I scarcely paid attention to the opposite bank, deeming it impossible for James to have crossed without being swept away. But then when I heard his voice, I spun around only to see him standing on the other side of the stream. To my amaze, it meant that didn't seem frightened or anxious. James wandered through the snow in his overcoat and boots, seemingly carefree. I rushed across the stream, scooping him up into my arms. I didn't scold him. Instead, relief washed over me, and I could see that he was scared to tears welled up in his eyes upon seeing Angie, who was also crying. I carried him back to the yurt where my wife awaited, confused and angry. After recounting the ordeal to my wife, she expressed anger at her daughter and then at me again, but primarily we were all just relieved that we had found James's affiend unharmed, avoiding a potential Amber Alert. Once we calmed down a bit, we had dinner, put the kids to bed, and I couldn't help but ask James something that had been gnawing at me since it popped into my head just after dinner. I asked him, "How did you get across that stream, buddy?" We were all so relieved to have found James safe and sound, so that was the main thing on my mind. I never really thought about how I'd gotten across until that moment. James's responses and to shiver down my spine, making my blood run cold. He said the snowman carried me. Of course, I knew Oznowman Koo didn't have carried him across Annecy Stream, but someone had, and that thought made me feel sick to my stomach in the most delicate way possible. I gently told James it couldn't have been a snowman, and asked if it was maybe a person dressed in white clothes or with snow on their hair or shoulder. She shook his head and repeated, "The snowman carried me." Before I could press further, he closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, not more than 5 or 10 minutes later. I couldn't imagine what he had gone through or why he didn't react more strongly to being taken by a stranger there. The next morning, we were on our way back home, not even considering asking for our fund. Due to how shaken we were turned, I contacted the police to report what had happened within a day. They confirmed our worst fears. On the opposite side of the stream, alongside James's skinny footprints, were larger footprints that had undoubtedly been left by his potential abductor. James later told us that the person who carried him had worn a white hat or light-colored clothing. They had carried him through the woods for a brief moment before setting him down and walking away. Jam didn't recall any words exchanged or feeling scared during the encounter. It was bizarre for a child not to react when picked up by a complete stranger, but there was something deeply unsettling about the whole incident. The memory of they continues to haunt me, leaving me with unanswered questions and a profound sense of unease. The thought of a stranger taking my son and then letting him go chills me to the bone, and I can't help but wonder what might have happened if they hadn't decided to release him. My name is Jim and I live in Northeast Louisiana. A few weeks ago, my friends Dave, Ryan, Jess, and I embarked on an unforgettable trip to visit some of my family in Washington State. Dave and I were both 18 years old, while Ryan and Jess were a year older at 19. Our adventure began in late October when we packed up all our belongings and set out on a long road trip from the swamps of Louisiana to the scenic landscapes of Washington. Our visit to my uncle's house in Washington, Washington was enjoyable, filled with laughter and catching up with relatives we hadn't seen years. A sore time in Washington was coming to a close. Ryan suggested that we spend our last night camping in the nearby woods. Dave and Jess readily agreed to the idea, but I was a bit hesitant. A million different thoughts raced through my mind, but in the end, I decided to go along with it. We borrowed 2 tents from my uncle and ventured into the woods, setting up our campsite not too far from his house. If we unzipped our tent doors, We could barely make out the faint glow of his porch light in the distance. We were in a remote area with no neighbors 4 miles around. It felt isolated but in a thrilling way. After spending the evening by the warm, crackling fire we had built, well decided it was time to call it tonight, well, all except for Jess, who wanted to savor a little more peace and solitude beneath the starry sky. It figured, why not? I joined her, and we continued to chat for about 20 more minutes, basking in the serenity of the forest. The next happened is saw something massive moving in the darkness about 20 yards away from us. It was colossal, at least 10 tall. Or so it seemed in the dim light. Panic surged through me's a million. Thoughts raced through my mind. Jess and I exchanged nervous glances and, without a word, retreated to one of the tents. We woke up Ryan, who was still half asleep, and in hushed, he mumbled, "What the hell's going on?" He grabbed his hatchet and sat up, trying to make sense of our incoherent explanations. "Go back to sleep, y'all," Ryan finally said, putting his hatchet down and curling back into his sleeping bag. Around 20 minutes later, we heard again the ominous footsteps, slow and deliberate, encircling our tent. Ryan was now fast asleep, oblivious to the eerie. Reasons outside quietly reached for Ryan's hatchet and held it tightly in my hand. With my other hand, I covered Jess's mouth to keep her from screaming, realized that we had left Dave alone in his tent with no means of defense. Jess bravely volunteered to step outside with a hatchet. She cautiously ventured out. She immediately recoiled, her breath coming in heavy, terrified gasps. I urged her to explain what she had seen, but she could only stammer about something vast and solid black lurking in the shadows. I couldn't let her face this unknown menace alone. With hatchet in hand, I stepped out of the tent, and there it was, the colossal figure looming over our campsite, peering down at our tent. My heart raced, and as swung the hatchet blindly at its legend. Sheer terror, a pain scream pierced the night as the enigmatic creature fled into the darkness. The scream jolted Dave and Ryan awake. They rushed to our side, demanding to know what had happened. Before we could respond, Ryan looked down at the deep massives left in the mud. Dave's eyes widened in astonishment. "Is that a Bigfoot?" he exclaimed, my cousin alerted by our camote. On arrived at the scene with a pistol and a lantern in hand. What the hell was that? She shouted, her voice trembling. Ryan pointed at the enormous footprints. "I ain't never coming without a gun again," he declared, his voice filled with determination. I couldn't shake off the fear that had taken hold of me. That night's sleep remained elusive until returned to the familiar comforts of Louisiana. That was one creepy and unforgettable night, one that none of us would ever forget. I've been a long time listen here, but today I'm finally sharing my own story, one that's far from those creepy guys stared at me tales. This is the story of how my best friend from college, Tyler, and I almost met Tour de Mise in the woods. And let me assure you, it's not just about creepy staring, it's about survival fear and a scar to prove it back in college at CUD. Tyler and I developed a strange fascination with survivalism during our sophomore year. We lived off campus working part-time jobs and were within a stone's throw of Chief Mountain in Mount. Blue sky hiking became our go-to method for blowing off steam and staying fit. Our interests started during freshman year when we were still on campus, but after we moved into our apartment, we watched a movie one night that ignited our curiosity. Even further, the movie was called Alive, and it depicted the harrowing true story of a South American rugby team whose plane crash landed in the Andes Mountains. To survive the freezing conditions and injuries, they resorted to consuming the flesh of their deceased teammates. It was an intense film, and it captured our imaginations. We couldn't help but ask ourselves, what would we do in a similar situation? It became a debate on how hungry we'd have to be before resorting to cannibalism. Muggerpick. Indeed, obviously we never wanted to put that to the test. Instead, we decide on the next best thing, heading into the mountains during peak snowfall and attempting to camp for a night or two to see if we could handle it. Now, before I continue, let me emphasize that what we did is not something I'd recommend. Wilderness camping is risky enough, but doing it during the dead of winter is downright foe. Oliardi, but being the naive college students we thought it was a brilliant idea. So after planning over Christmas break, we set off on the first weekend back at school. We drove up to Echo Lake Park near Rogers Peak, parked our car, and ventured into the snowy forest in the direction of Mount Goliath. Took us a few miles, but we eventually found a sheltered spot among the pine trees where we cleared a space for our camp. I won't bore you with the gritty details of how miserable it was to camp in those conditions. Suffice it to say, it sucked. Everything stayed wet, making it a constant struggle to keep the fire going, and Webb barely got any sleep. The experience was so terrible that we decided to pack up and leave around 6:30 or 7 in the morning, using the first light to find our way back to the car and escape to the warmth of home. I used my trusty jet boil to make some coffee inside the tent, and after warming up and caffeinating ourselves, Wes started packing. Tyler finished a minute or two before Methan opened the tent flap and said he was going to take a quick pee. I nodded, still half asleep, and continued with my task moments. Later, Tyler returned but didn't enter the tent. Instead, he squatted by the entrance and asked, "Is your knife within arm's reach?" I assumed he had spotted a bear. Sometimes they woke up from hibernation early, and when food was scarce, they posed a significant threat to campers. Curiously, I inquired about the issue, expecting to hear about a bear. However, Tyler's response left me mused. There's a dude, he said he was watching Mete Leak Relief washed over Mies. I processed the situation, so what if some early morning hiker had given Tyler a disapproving look while relieving himself in the snow, but then Tyler added a chilling detail. The guy had a gun out. This didn't immediately send me into a panic, given that seeing armed individuals in Colorado's mountains wasn't entirely uncommon, but maybe I was too tired, too cold, or too eager to leave. But if ailed to gravity of the situation, Tyler's explanation might have been inadequate. Or perhaps my mind couldn't comprehend the danger lurking in those snow. We woods-a-zat there bewildered when in reality we should have been running for our lives. Suddenly, Tyler turned his head. Sia's widening and his scream, "Get out of the tent." I hadn't even finished packing, but his urgency spurred me into action. I scrambled out of the tent, my heart pounding. What is outside left me. Frozen in fear, it was a hunter one figure with a skim-ass balaclava covering his face. He remained silent as we slowly backed away, trying to communicate that we didn't want any trouble and apologizing if we had trespassed. Webb babbled on trying to defuse the situation, but the man remained mute. Then, to our horror, he raised his rifle, aiming it directly at us. Seemed to slow. As we waited for the inevitable shot, bang, the first shot was deafening, echoing through the woods as we sprinted away from our campsite. It felt like an eternity between the first shot and the second. I vividly recall thinking he's aiming any second now and I'm dead. Then another bang, and I felt something strike the back of my left thigh. My leg threatened to give way, but I pushed through the pain and ran alongside Tyler through the dense trees. I knew I had been hit. The bullet fragment had punched into my thigh. But thanks to the pine trees, it hadn't severed my femoral artery. Warm blood streamed down my legus, is printed, but the cold air made it feel strangely cold at the same time, a sensation I never wanted to experience again. In a blur, we made it down the mountain. Either the hunter couldn't get another shot at us lost, or decided to flee Theria before we could find someone to call the police. To say I got off lucky would be an understatement. The pine trees had thwarted his aim, and the bullet had fragmented, slicing open the top of my thigh. As is printed, the doctor later told me that if the bullet had hit the trees lightly differently, if I had been running a bit slower, the fragment could have severed my femoral artery and I would have bled out within minutes. As for the man who had taken shots at us, the police questioned a few hunters but never made any arrest. Noon was charged with attempting to murder. Use upon that mountain, if you ask me, the guy was just a hunter, not someone looking to shoot people intentionally. He might have been a psycho who thought. Witnesses, why not? I guess there are people out there who want to know what it feels like to kill, but I'm not implying that every hunter thinks that way. I just know for certain that at least one of them does. When I was a kid of about 12 years old, I used to live in a small town just outside Johnson City, Tennessee, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. This was back in the 70s, a time when people were different about their kids. We would goof all day and not come home until dark, and folks didn't worry about the same kinds of things we do now, but perhaps we should have. We would explore the woods, find abandoned mines and caves, and camp outside on warm summer nights. We weren't stuck in front of the TV like kids today. Back then, you could only get 3 channels in the mountains, so it was pretty boring to just stay home. In retrospect, we did some pretty dumb things and took some insane risks that could have cost us our lives. But somehow we survived. The story starts early one morning when I and my brothers and sisters were waiting for the school bus. It was around 7 a.m. on a cold November morning, probably in 1973 or 1974. We noticed the grave along the road, moving, heard the sound of rocks falling, and could see dirt and dust rising from a nearby ridge. This continued for about 10 seconds and was enough to make us run back into the house. The radio in my dad's old car said there was a 7.3 magnitude earthquake in Claiborne County to the north. I remember my dad saying it was felt all the way in Charlotte, North Carolina, some 100 miles south. We up missing school that day, which was pretty cool for us. So it took off like we usually did into the woods by that ridge because we wanted to see which rocks had fallen on our way to the ridge. We saw a place where the ground had opened up, revealing a cave entrance. Real cave entrances, which aren't cleared for tourists, look a lot different than the ones in movies or pictures. This one was covered with roots, leaves, and dirt, but you could see inside it pretty well. We went back to the house, got some ropeen, my dad's old lantern. Before long, we were back at the new cave with our supplies, gathering up our courage to go in wedlock. At about finding gold or diamonds, maybe turning into a secret hideout, there were 4 of us, including 2 twin boys, my best friend, Dane and me. Dane and I were inseparable for the most part, while the twin boys were always getting into trouble and used profanity a lot. But they were always trying to outdo each other, so they were fun to hang around with. We climbed down the embankment to the mouth of the cave and turned on the lantern. We pulled away roots and leaves to make the cave mouth big enough to climb through. I stuck my head inside and was immediately met with the smell of death. The air was so thick with the smell of it that I gagged. Not to be discouraged, I pulled my shirt up over my nose and pushed past the roots until I was inside Dan Dead Myth Light, and inside is a wallow flat room about 4 thigh and easily 20 feet across the cave went further back. But my light couldn't make out any details past that Dan crawled through next, and then the twin shouldering the lantern ashy as I could. We proceeded into the cave, and once we were inside, we could see bunts of animal all over the floor. Some of them had been picked clean, while others, Lal had meat in them. Then none of the twins found a dog collar on one of the bones, revealing that these were their manes of cats, dogs, sheep, deer, and small rodents. The bones were scattered around the floor as if they'd been tossed away from the carcasses. I remember thinking would have done this. That's when in Otis 2 lights reflecting the lamp in the back of the cave. It didn't make a noise. But I remember saying, guys, we need to get out of here now. It never took my eyes off those 2 pinpoints of light. It must have been something in my voice, because Dan perked up and follow. Ed my gaze, without another word, Will got out of the cave as fast as we could. There was only one thing. It could be a bear's denant side. Will ran back to the house and told her dad what we saw. We was getting ready to go to work the second shift at the Blue Jean factory in town. He told us to stay away from that until he could go check it out, move her juice, and told us that if we went back out there, she would tear our butts up. Getting mauled by a bear was not something we wanted. So we agreed just to be sure. Dad gave us a few chores to keep us occupied until he got back home splee. Ting firewood and breaking up coal, that was enough to end our adventures that day. The rest of the week was uneventful except for the news of the earthquake. That was the topic at school and at home for the rest of the week. By the weekend, Dane and I had decided we were going to go back and explore that cave to see if there really was a bear in it. Pretty dumb, but we decided to go armed with pocket nibs and sharp sticks to take care of the bear. If there really was one, or at least we thought we climbed the hill back to where the cave mouth was. A couple of nighttime rain shad ashed away the mud and made the mouth of the cave bigger and easier to get in and out of. We made our way inside the cave and past the smell, which was still very much permeating from the entrance on inside. We crouched and walked back to the backside of the cave. The cave entrance narrowed to an opening in the back wall that sloped down at a pretty steep hang like a set of steps. We continued deeper and noticed there were no bones or animal remains back in this part of the cave. It went back another 100 feet and stopped at a rather large hole that seemed to go stray. Down the strangest part was that we could feel warm air coming up from out of the hole. We couldn't see the bottom when shining the light down into it. We didn't have enough rope to go farther, so we made our way back out of the cave. Undaunted, we wanted to know how deep that hole was. We used the lantern to build a fire and made some makeshift torches. Dan was one of the best fire starters I'd ever seen. Within minutes, we were equipped with torches and were back in the cave. We dropped a torch down the hole, and it hit the bottom about 20 feet down. It opened up into a room with a dire covered floor. Then there was a growl unlike anything I'd ever heard in my life. It was coming from somewhere down in that hole, from something. It sounded like a tiger or alien, some sort of big cat. More than that, a bear in its cream. So loud we dropped our gear and covered our ears. We could see from the torch lights that it was circling the torch, but staying away from most of. It was looking up at us, big and lean, and definitely not a bear, more like a mountain lion. But its fur was black as pitch, and its ears were like a Doberman's, straight and tall like horns. It didn't look Like any cat, dog, or bear its eyes glowed in that firelight like two hot coals, it would look at Methanat. Dane as if it were trying to decide who it would kill first. When it screamed again, it was like having a ton of sand dumped on you from above. I went down to my knees and tried to curl into a ball. The scream made me feel weak, unable to think or move my head. Felt like it was a gong or someone had placed Agent Bell on my head and started to B8 at. I felt sick, confused, and pain all at the same time. Dance collapsed into a ball with his hands on. His ears he had dropped the lantern and dith. Adrolled off the edge down into the hole. It went pitch black up, but the bottom of the hole burst with light. As the lantern shattered right beside the thing, another scream came from it this time. A scream like it was in pain. We didn't feel weakened from it. This time, we were just terrified. It was like the spell had been broken and we were free. Our survival instincts kicked in and we took off. And I made our way up the slope as fast as we could. We could tell that whatever that was in the hole was going to come. After us, we just knew that it would not let us live for dropping that. Lantern, it was like there was a connection to the thing in our minds, and it was talking to us. Up the slope, we could see the dim light at the entrance, and we quickly made our way back. Just before we reached the mouth of the cave, we heard the scream again. This time it was like being hit by water coming out of a fire hose. It knocked both of us down as we desperately covered our ears, then tumbled forward toward the entrance. We got out of the hole and ran all the way home with tears pouring down our face. Neither one of us could hear for a week. I remember having a headache that was so bad my parents took me to the emergency room. The doctor couldn't find anything wrong with us other than the many scratches and bruises we had. From the cave, we were told that we were very lucky to be alive, as there were a lot of poisonous gases in caves, and that was probably what was causing the headaches, but it should pass about a week later. It was just ringing sound in my ear, but I will never forget it. I remember having the strangest dreams for months afterward. Dreams where I was back in that cave with that screaming thing. I would wake up curled into a ball again. Just a little key before, I think Dane experienced the same thing whenever went back to the cave. It was very unlike us, but we weren't courageous enough to go back there. My family moved soon afterwards, and Dan and I lost contact many years later. I went back after hearing that they'd had another earthquake. I wanted to visit and see if that cave was still there. It is, although it looks like part of the roof collapsed in on it. It tried to look Dan too, but it had moved away. The twins were there working at a local garage. They said Dan lived there for about 10 more years. He never quit. Owed over the experience, actually, he ended up being sent away to a special school for the deaf for several years. When he did come back home, he was a very quiet person, didn't make many friends, and he lived with his parents and worked at the mill for a while. Everyone said he kept to himself and that he liked to drink. I don't know what it is that the earthquake opened up back then. I guess I'll never know. I do know this, though. It was more than just a bar, more than just a mountain lion. This thing had the ability to use its cry to disable its enemies or prey. I'm not sure which we were to also know it was smart enough to get into our heads. I've never known another animal that can do that. Losing someone close to you is a process that unravels you bit by bit. It's like losing a piece of yourself, a part of your very essence one moment. You're living in a world where you can spend all the time in the world with them, sharing your thoughts, your laughter, your tears, and then in the blink of an eye, they're gone, and you're left with a million words to say, but none to say them to. It's as if they take all your joy and warmth with them, leaving you to wander through life like an empty shell. The earth becomes a cold, barren husk, devoid of color in life. In the midst of this aimless drift of your mind, occasionally toys with the idea of joining the mind just to be united with the person you held so dear, my older brother, and I were two peas in a pod, a pair of despondent souls who found meaning in each other's company in our childhood. We were inseparable. We did everything together, so much so that we couldn't even bear to be in separate classes during elementary school. The thought of being apart for too long would lead to protests that my parents still reminisced about. Our parents owned a vast expanse of land in Washington state, including Gadensa Forest behind our house. Every single day without fail, my brother and I embarked on a long and arduous journey into those woods. We would spend hours playing together, our young imaginations running wild. We'd pretend to be knights building castles out of sticks strewn about the forest floor and laying siege to each other's fortresses. Looking back, no, those are my fondest memories of my sibling and me. But as we're aged our teenage years, something changed. My brother and I started to drift apart. They began to allocate the majority of his free time to his free, quaint girlfriends while I dedicated myself to academics and a part-time job. Wes started talking to each other less and less, and the sore conversations dwindled. The divide between us grew wider. It was a silent acknowledgement of what was happening. A decision Webb both made to ignore the growing chasma choice. I would later regret deeply. It was during the final weeks of my junior year in high school that everything changed, the weight of tests and exams, inundated Ms., weeping aside all other aspects of my life, including my social relationships. I had friends, but like met. Hey were heavily engrossed in their studies, being the terrible time manager. I couldn't spare even a minute from my relentless preparation for finals to socialize. That was when my brother extended an unexpected invitation. He offered Meth a chance to attend a graduation party being held by an acquaintance of his. Normally it was for seniors only, but he was willing to make an exception for me. I hesitated as parties weren't my scene, but after weighing my options, I reluctantly agreed. Perhaps it was my desire to impress my brother to rekindle the bond that had dead away over the years that convinced Metaga the rest of the week passed in abluras. I diligently chipped away at my remaining homework. When Saturday morning arrived, I was greeted by my brother's mischievous smile. I had overslept, and he took full advantage of the opportunity to wake me up with a jolt. Wakey, wakey, sleepy head. It's 11. I want to make sure my favorite little bro is ready for the night. Out, he said, patting my head. I groaned, still half asleep. I hate you so much, man. I muttered. He chuckled and left my room, utterly proud of his successful wake call. The aroma of bacon and eggs greeted me. I got dressed and headed down to the kitchen. My mother was at the stove, and she greeted me with a warm smile. I returned the courtesy and took my seat at the kitchen table. When my mother finished cooking, she set the plates on the table. What's the occasion? I asked. She smiled. It's been a while since you two have spent some time together. It thought I'd commemorate the occasion. I looked down at my plate. Guilt was hanging over me. Well, Mom, things get busy. I can't balance it all, schoolwork and everything. The important thing, she said, is that you're making an effort now as the morning turned into afternoon and afternoon into evening. I started having second thoughts about attending the party. I was convinced that once where lived my brother would simply forget about me, leaving me alone in a sea of inbred teenagers. But I pushed those thoughts aside to impress him. Rekindle our long-lost bond. I dressed in a manner that reflected the greaser aesthetic, wearing denim jeans, a leather jacket, and a muscle underneath. I grabbed my car keys and ventured to collect my brother. When he saw me, he looked genuinely proud. My little dweeb of a brother, all grown up. Now we're marked. I'm telling you, dude, if you just give it a shot, the ladies will be chasing you. Is murked and ushered him out of the door. Not I'm for complimenting me. Even if I am the superior sibling, we've got to get going. It's an unusually chilly Maine night, he commented as we exited tea. He housed the frigid air hit us like a freight train. I opened the garage and was shuffled into my old 79 Camaro. My side hustle during high school had allowed me to save up for this car, and I was proud of it. We're in for a bit of a drive, I said, but it'll be worth it. The trip to the residence was surprisingly lengthy, taking us down multiple back roads. About 2/3 of the way there, the pavement turned to dirt. Finally, we pulled into our destination at around 7 p.m. We were the first to arrive, and Howard, my brother's friend, and the host of the party welcomed dues inside, offering food and drinks. It was 1985, and the laws against teenage alcohol consumption were not as strictly enforced as they are now. At least note in our part of Washington, within the hour, a sizable crowd had gathered in Howard's yard. My brother and I helped set up the grill, and someone had brought a boombox blasting Metal Health by Quiet Riot at maximum volume as the party picked up pace. I found myself pleasantly surprised by how much I was enjoying. Myself had expected the experience to be H-or, but it was quite the opposite. I played a few games of blackjack with some of the other guests, and even served as a referee for a drinking contest involving my brother, which had admittedly lost by a wide margin. As the night wore on, the party began to die down, and many guests started to take their leave. I had abstained from alcohol for the duration of the party, unlike my brother, who had overindulged and was having troubles speaking coherently as the last of the attendees disappeared on the dark road leading away from Ward's house. I helped him clean up the mess left in the party's wake. In the meantime, my brother lay sprawled out on a sava, clutching his head once we deemed the place immaculate. I helped my brother to his feet, and we prepared to head out, but But Howard stopped me, said just because the party itself is over doesn't mean the fun has to be. There's this deserted family estate just down the road from here. A lot of people say it's haunted, want to go check it out. I hesitated given my brother's level of intoxication. It likely wouldn't be a great idea to venture out into the woe. Odsta Som decrepit old mansion just as I was about to reply my brother quickly took Howard up on his offer. Charmaine, even if it's haunted, he slurred, it wouldn't stop me from going, glared at them, incredulity written across my face. It's late ace it is, and we have a curfew. Mom's going to kill yous if we go. My brother turned to me, raising an eyebrow. I've already had a couple of drinks. Not like I can do much worse. As I defeated, I knew I couldn't change his mind, but I also couldn't allow my brother and Howard to go alone. I gave in, and so the three of us charged forth into the icy night. Illingen to my car. I had the unfortunate disposition of being the designated driver, a role assigned to me by Howard after he explained that his vehicle's transmission had failed recently. Howard directed me to the supposedly haunted Ed property. As west sped down winding, sparsely populated wooded back roads, the street lights and sparse forestry began to morph into dense, undisturbed woods. Eventually, we halted in front of an enormous pair of rusted iron gates, decorated with overgrown vegetation. From what I could tell, there had a ton point being a pair of initials welded into the gates, but they had since been removed. We carefully exited the vehicle, perhaps intimidated by the looming barriers. Howard glanced at me and my brother, hint of mischief in his expression. You're ready to see some ghost guys. I shrugged, unconvinced throughout my life. I had never been very religious or spiritual. I simply reasoned that when you die, you cease to exist. I didn't have any intention of changing my mind. Now that we stood in the presence of this mansion, my brother seemed to have sobered up a bit. This stance is shifting from relax AED to knees. Why, I think so, he replied shakily. Howard shoved open the gate, submitting an audible creaking sound that made my skin crawl. Hep proceeded to gesture for us to take the lead. How chivalrous of you to make us monster bait. Is narkily stated, trudging my way through the overgrown grass, my brother following suit. The task of plowing through the excessive undergrowth, guarding the estate was rather difficult. Many thorn bushes had inconveniently decided to plant themselves on our path. In due time, the dark silhouette of the house began to materialize in front of us for all intents and purposes. The place looked very similar to its description. Much of the siding and roofing had partially or entirely rotted away, exposing some of the framework. Where windows had once been, there were now only gaping holes. There appeared to be a wooden deck connected to the entrance of the house, which lay astoundingly intact. We worked our way to it, and with each step it took, my sense of trepidation slowly crept up, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. I wash air because of my brother, and I couldn't let fear hold me back. As we neared the deck, Howard pushed past us and strode over to the door. He tried the knob, but it refused to budge. Danja thang on. I'm going to kick this thing in, he exclaimed dramatically. He began to vigorously slam his foot on the door, and after 3 or 4 tries, it gave way, crashing into the shadowy interior of the house. I rolled my eyes, angered by his lack of discretion, but I dared not oppose him at the moment. Now certainly wasn't the time to argue. Howard was the first who sauntered inside, accompanied by my brother, who was unusually quiet. It threaded carefully, trying to the sounds of my footsteps while I pursued them. As the pitch black enveloped me, I reached for my pocket and produced my handheld flashlight. When I switched it on, my jaw dropped. The entire interior of the house was spotless. There were no signs of deck. Not a single speck of dust. It was like the family had never left. What they stuttered before looking to my complying that they had similar reactions. My brother at last spoke up. This place is missing windows, but somehow the furniture and floors are untouched. Am I dreaming, Howard? And I must have been too stunned to reply. Both of us remained speechless as a neary hush fell over. The three began to become aware of a distinct noise emanating from the second story. The sound of intense sobbing. My eyes were the size of baseballs, and I glanced at Howard and my brother, panic visible in their faces. Howard spoke in a whisper. We've got to check it out. Someone could be hurt in here. My eyes grew even wider. Are you kidding? Who would be crying like that in the dead of night in the middle of nowhere? Howard didn't respond. Instead, he began getting toward the staircases leading up to the second floor, left with another option, being the self-proclaimed alpha males that we were. My brother and I stumbled after him. As we trampled up the stairs, my sense of trepidation grew stronger, drowning out a logical thought. We reached the top of the staircase and were presented with an extensive hallway on both sides. We promptly changed our course while the distressing noise emanated from an unseen room to the right. Howard led the way, my increasing terror climbing to a crescendo, until I realized the noise was coming from the very end of the hallway. If it became necessary to run, our escape would be significantly prolonged. I shone my light down the hall to get a visual on the source, finding that the door to the room was shut, seeing this as an opportunity. It shook Howard's shoulder in a final effort to convince. Ahem, this wasn't a good idea. He once again soundly ignored me without wasting a word. Howard advanced toward the door as the crying became deafening in one motion. He twisted the knob with a click that made my heart stop. The doors swung open, and all at once the sobbing ceased. The only thing I heard was a faint ringing in my ears. My hands violently trembled as I raised my light to the now gaping doorway. What I will forever be burned into my memory, etched into my very being inside the room in a fetal position. There was a figure. It was slender, its colorless flesh light. Lie stretched across heavy bones. The proportions of this being were not human-like. Now this creature possessed arms extending well over half the length of its body, ending in sharp talons resembling overgrown fingernails. Long, greasy black hair was draped across its shoulders and back, forming a tangled, shadowy curtain that obscured its features. It lay in a grotesque mound on the floor, unmoving and eerily still despite this apparent lifelessness. Its spine protruded from its backside, a horrifying series of malignant lumps and deformities as it stood frozen in. Place my mind struggled to process the grotesque sight before me. It was as if my eyes were feeding my brain, a nightmare conjured from some malevolent corner of my subconscious. My body refused to obey my desperate commands to flee or blink beside me. Howard, who had backed away from the door with a mixture of fear and caution, made one fatal mistake. The pressure of his back-pedaling foot released a nearly imperceptible sound, a creak. It was just loud enough to capture the creature's attention. In an instant, it perked up, itches strising and falling rapidly, as if it began to gasp and convulsiate breath, sounding like a tortured, wheezing scream. The creature's writhing seemed to stretch on for an eternity. My brother, Howard, and I were held captive by the horrifying spectacle, unable to terrorize away from the nightmare unfolding before us. Finally, it ceased its convulsions, and a nearing noise escaped its unseen mouth, a dreadful, demented laughter that echoed in the room like a sickly woman's giggle. Then, with a series of bone-snapping cracks, the creature began to move. It rotated its neck, slowly revealing its hideous face. Even now, nearly 4 decades later, that image remains etched in my mind, a grotesque reflection of my flashlight in its beady soulless eyes. It had nose, only slits that served as nostrils, and its mouth, far human, was a gaping mainland with rows of needle-like teeth, dripping with what could only be blood. As the creature rose to a towering height, I began to grasp the gravity of our situation. It may have been 6'2" and athletically built, but this monstrosity exceeded my stature. Panic surged within as my brother shook me out of my trance, shoving me down the hallway. You, with a desperate urgency, hailed something, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins drowned out most of his words. I sprinted down the hallway, reached the stairs, and hurled myself downward, crashing onto the wooden tiles below. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the exit, glancing behind me as Howard reached the doorway. Just seconds after, me and my brother was descending the stairs as I yankied open the car door and dove inside. It fumbled with the ignition, and the car roared to life just as my brothers leaped through the gates. The creatures had perched atop. Hair on gates, its mouth still glistening with crimson the liquid, but it made no move to pursue us further. We sped away, breaking numerous traffic laws as we raced down the empty country roads in terrified silence. The soft thum of the engine was our only comfort when we returned to Howard's home. He hurriedly vanished into his house. I harbored resentment toward him. After all, he had been the one insisting on investigating the mansion. In the first place, my brother and I were left alone in the car, and he eventually broke the seal. I think it's best we just pretend this never happened. Penned, he suggested, his voice trembling. I agreed, even though I knew deep down that we could never forget what we had witnessed. That night life went him, but my brother's health took a severe turn. He suffered from unexplained HE's muscle spasms and nausea. We admitted him to the hospital in July, and he began describing a tall woman tormenting him in his nightmares. The doctors could find no physical cause for his condition, and despite our hopes she didn't pull through, I held his hand. As she passed away, my tears flowing freely, my brother's death left an indelible mark on our family. I couldn't focus on academics as I grappled with the loss, but one thing he had said haunted me, a woman in his dreams. It had to be the same creature we had encountered. It taken my brother from me on a chilling October morning. After I turned 18, I persuaded my father to lend me his hunting rifle under the pretense of going hunting with friends. Filled with determination, I set off for the old abandoned family estate deep in the woods. After a long drive, I reached the familiar Iran gates and paused in my car, reflecting on the profound impact this place had on my life. Loading the riffle, I pushed open the gates and began my approach. As I drew closer to the house, I raised the rifle's muzzle to the sky and fired 3 rounds into the air. There was no response. I called out in anger, but still there was only silence. Fueled by rage, I stormed into the house, determined to confront the creature that had taken my brother. The interior was a scene of devastation. The once sturdy furniture and tiling now reduced to ruins. My bewilderment briefly overwhelmed me, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. I meticulously searched everywhere, closet and crevice, but found not race of the creature. My spirit crushed, I exited the crumbling home, defeated. As I stepped outside, rain began to fall, its cold drops battering me. I could no longer contain my grief, and tears welled up in my eyes. I wanted to apologize to my brother for failing him, but there I knelt in the field of silence, alone with my anguish. I've been working in the film industry for a decade now, and while my role isn't exactly glamorous, it's incredible to be a part of this world. In a nutshell, I scout locations for films and ensure they're suitable for specific scenes. Many of my colleagues fell in love with movies at nearly age, and the same holds true for me. My grandfather, a producer in the 1960s, worked alongside legendary talents like Audrey Hepburn, Alfred Hitchcock, John Wayne, and even Elvis Presley as a young child. My grandfather regaled my brother, cousins, and me with captivating stories about the mythical world of Hollywood during that era. Yet, as I grew older, I couldn't help but notice my grandmother's discomfort whenever he spoke about his time in the industry. Her uneasy demeanor didn't escape my brothers and my notice, and we began to speculate about the cause. Unfortunately, we eventually arrived at the unsettling possibility that my grandfather might have had an affair during those wild Hollywood years. It seemed like the logical explanation for my grandmother's strange behavioral, though we acknowledged it wasn't fair to jump. To conclusions, Hollywood during that period was notorious for its extravagant parties and beautiful actresses, and my grandfather, being a prominent producer, fit the profile all too well. So I am sharing this story now. Last month, my brother and I decided to finally confront my grandmother about what really happened during her time in Hollywood. When I no longer wanted to hearth or romanticize tales my grandfather had spun for us. Given my own career in the industry, we needed to know the truth, especially if it had been an affair. We approached the subject with utmost delicacy, not wanting to upset or dredge up painful memories. Until the day he passed away, my grandmother had always expressed profound love and admiration for my grandfather, which made it seem even more peculiar that he might have strayed my brother, the smooth talker of the two. Fuss finally asked Grandma, why did Grandpa of Hollywood, and why do you always go quiet and leave the room whenever had told us? Those are stories. My grandmother took a deep breath, seemingly preparing herself to share a long-held secret. She began to narrate her story, weaving a tale only an elder could recount in detail. We couldn't have been more wrong in our assumptions. My grandmother couldn't recall the exact year, but during her husband's tenure as a producer, he decided to move to Hollywood at the time in her early 20s. She harbored dreams of becoming an actress, and she was undeniably beautiful. My grandfather used his connections to secure auditions for her and introduce her to some influential figures in the industry. However, my grandmother was determined not to have her success handed to her merely because she was married. Oa producer used a different last name during auditions and never mentioned her connection to my grandfather, wanting to be judged solely on her talent. After several failed auditions, my grandmother nearly gave up on her dream of acting and considered trying her hand at modeling. She had received some offers, but she had last audition for what seemed like a significant film opportunity. She recounted how my grandfather was skeptical about this audition, having never heard of the director or the film. However, my grandmother was stubborn and urged him to trust her instincts. On her way to the audition, she got lost and stumbled upon a dilapidated building on the outskirts of town. Being new to the area, she didn't question the location and assumed it was a creative choice made by the director, perhaps even his office. As she walked through the door, only to find 4 individuals inside, 3 women and 1 man, all masked. In an instant, my grandmother realized her peril and tried to flee, but 2 of the women caught her and subjected her to a brutal beating. After a few agonizing minutes, they tied her to a chair, leaving her. Alplesony of the women then delivered a chilling ultimatum. My grandmother had to assist the Minare robbery if she wished to survive. The consequence of refusing were too grim to imagine. My grandmother reluctantly agreed, hoping that she could find a way to escape this terrifying situation. The woman outlined their plans. She would rob an apartment for them. The Forasants assured her that there would be cash on a table inside, and my grandmother had no choice but to comply. She assumed that once inside the apartment, she could locate a phone or, better yet, find the occupant. Tanda explained her predicament. They reached the apartment building, and my grandmother's plan began to unravel. The man from the group accompanied her inside, holding a menacing pipe in his hand, which filled her with dread. She suspected that the pipe was intended for her. The apartment's door was unlocked, and they entered. My grandmother was handed a cloth sack and instructed to fill it with cash, assuring her that money would be found on a nearby table. As she cautiously collected the cash, her mind raced, searching for an escape plan. Suddenly, she spotted a glass vase on the table filled with fresh flowers. With quick thinking and desperation surging through her veins, she seized the vase and shattered it against the man's face, have fell to the ground in pain, allowing her the opportunity to bolt from the apartment. My grandmother stumbled upon a back exit and sprinted several blocks, her heart pounding with fears. She finally encountered a police car parked nearby and approached it frantically, breathlessly. She explained everything to the officers, desperately pleading for help. Back in those days, the police didn't always respond with urgency when it came to women's distress, and it took them a moment to believe her and take her statements seriously. Eventually, they contacted my grandfather, who decided to raise hell to ensure justice prevailed. Thankfully, my grandmother provided a detailed description of her captors, leading to the arrest of one of the women. However, the other three perpetrators remained at large. My grandmother never discovered the identity of the apartment's owner, but suspected involvement in the sinister underbelly of Hollywood. During that era, the arrested admitted to framing my grandmother, intending to incapacitate her inside the apartment after she'd filled the bag with cash. They believed she was merely a young actress, and her capture at the scene would have been another tragic story lost in the dark world of show business. This harrowing nightmare had left my grandmother deeply scarred, compelling her to leave Hollywood and return to her parents' house. My grandfather followed several months later, and that's when they started their family. He told us uplifting and joyful stories to entertain us. Ildren, but whenever he mentioned his time in Hollywood, my grandmother couldn't help but recall the traumatic ordeal she endured. I can only imagine the horrors my grandmother experienced during that terrifying ordeal. I am grateful she managed to escape and find some semblance of justice. As for the three other monsters from that night, I can only hope that karma eventually caught up with them and justice was served in one form or another. I'll never forget that sound, the crashing of feet, tawdry leaves passing my tent. It was fast, like I had been visited by an Olympic sprinter 3 minutes to midnight. The first time it happened, I grabbed my gun and searched the surrounding area. Nothing, not a trace is settling in my sleeping bag. It wasn't 5 minutes before something ran past the tents. More 10 minutes later, I heard did again, that nothing. Further, as I waited for the sun to rise, the wilderness has always been my home away from home, my escape when life was I've been on more camping trips than I count, mostly alone. You see, I don't like people, so after many years abroad, another visit to the outdoors was way overdue. I had been scoping out a new camping site for a while. It was a few hours outside of town, but their views online were nothing short of glowing. This place prided itself on being for the solo traveler, with enough space for campers to pitch their tents without bothering each other. I was sold with the essentials packed, including my Beretta 92 pistol for safety, and made my way down the highway and eventually arrived at the location's reception off. Ice, while some people are more adventurous, I prefer to explore areas curated for campers. Sure, it comes with an entrance fee, but at least I'm likely to stumble on the land of a lunatic with a shotgun. As I stepped into the reception, I was immediately struck by a feeling of emptiness. It wasn't because I was alone. This was a primal reaction that I felt in my gut, like the space around me was stealing my energy. As ridiculous as that sounds, it's the best description I've been able to come up with. Reaching the front desk, I called out for someone to assist me. It was almost 2 in the afternoon, and I knew that the camping site would be preceded by a short hike as displayed on a nearby map. I didn't have to wait long before an old man in a blue cardigan arrived through the back office door. This guy was old, very old, at least 90. If I were to hazard a guess, he didn't act like it, though. He spoke like a younger man and was far friendlier than his grim appearance would lead you to believe, taking me through the rules and regulations of the land. He swiftly began saying something about the history of the area. Now I'm not a rude person, but my adventure was calling, and I had barely been paying attention to what was being said, perhaps too bluntly. It told the old man that it needed to be on my way. He was disappointed, sad in fact, but he didn't hesitate to guide me towards the start of the trail. Before I left, I was handed a pair of keys that would unlock a gate at the mouth of the forest. Finally, my holiday could begin. Despite the reception map stating that the forest was 2 more away, it took me many hours to reach the towering trees displayed on the website. At first, I wondered if my pace was too slow, but I knew I was as fit as I had ever. I was surprised that the map was so wrong, but I didn't think much of it by the time I reached the gate. The sun had begun to set, standing before the metal barrier. I noticed that the fences on each side stretched into an endless blur. It looked up at the massive tree line and peeked beyond the gate to see the wild world that I was eager to enter. It tried valiantly, but the key didn't work. It didn't even match the lock. The many odd elements of this trip started to add up, but I shook it off as I was in dire need of a meal, and my thoughts would only slow me down, I suppose what I didn't. Ext was illegal, but like Zed, I had little energy for an alternative solution. Thankfully, the gate was quite short, so it tossed my bag and joined my belongings by climbing up and over. At this point, I wasn't picky about a camping location, so I searched for the first bit of flat, open land, passing the hulking trees. The day's last sunlight shone through the branches. I stopped and appreciated nature's beauty for a brief moment. To my despair, this pause brought in the same feeling I had at the reception office. My stamina was waning, so instead of finding an appropriate pie, EC of ground, immediately put up my tent and prepared an outdoor area, forking with a week's supply of beans ready to prepare. I decided to lie down and rest before starting the fire. I hadn't planned on sleeping just yet, but after closing my eyes for a second, I was out like a light. I'll never forget the sound that woke me up. Something ran past my tent. Initially, I wondered if it was an animal, but 4T colliding with the ground is more distinct than you might think. Whatever this was, it was on 2 legs. I searched the area quite thoroughly, but found no sign of the unwelcome. A visitor back in my tent. I heard the noise 2 more times on both occasions. I rushed out to catch my guest in the ACT and nothing. I didn't get any more sleep that night. My mind was buzzing with the Ories. Maybe it was a bear on its hind legs, Neutran too quickly. If it was human, why was it running in the woods? I have no idea. Thinking back, no, what was more chilling than the crumbling leaves was the Erie's Islands. When I was waiting for the sound to come back, the new day brought more questions as I quickly learned that my surroundings weren't what I expected. Exiting the tent, tis the ashes of a burned out fire had started it before collapsing the night before. It didn't make sense. I surely would have noticed the scorched wood when I searched the area at midnight. Although I suppose the unwanted intruder had my attention at the time, I knew it was best for me to leave. I had planned to camp for 5 days, but one bizarre night was more than enough. The thought of the long hike back to the reception was daunting, but for the first time in my life, civilization was more appealing than the outdoors. As I packed my bags, I once again started to become drowsy. Was this due to my lack of sleep, or was it something else? I still don't know. Luckily, I have done training to operate on little rests, so packing my bags wasn't difficult. I was tired, but with my pistol strapped to my leg, I was ready to go. Tracking my movements from the day before, I followed the opening of the trees. I had sworn that I didn't travel that far into the woods, but after walking for an hour, I realized that I must have been wrong. I knew I had gone the right way after all. I pride myself on my sense of direction. I reached 1 hour and 32 minutes-ish. If dead my focus from the ground to the trees, while much of the bark surrounding me was an arid dish-brown shade, there were a few unique prints in the color gray. That's when I realized I was walking in a loop. I timed it in my watch. Every 12 minutes and 16 seconds, I passed Agent Redwood with a gray marking in the shape of an eagle's head. Every 60 minutes and 11 seconds, I passed a tree that looked like it was decaying. This happened over and over for what felt like hours. It tried everything going in the opposite direction, moving horizontally. Yet Irem ain't stuck in the same cycle. My spirit was willing, but my body was weak, and after walking an endless path, I passed out amongst the dry leaves. Perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised at what woke me up, but I was start-led nonetheless. The sound of the runner returned, but I didn't have the tent to protect me. The thin fabric wouldn't have done anything, but its absence still left me feeling. My instincts kicked in, and I reached for my gun, rising to my feet. I pulled out my flashlight and applied the Harris technique, crossing my arms to prepare for combat in the dead of night. The noises continued as I searched for its origin and noticed a quick shadow in the corner of my right eye and turned, firing 2 bullets. There was nothing there. The sound came back this time behind me. It took me only a second to spin my body and pull the trigger 3 times again. Nothing. I repeated this pattern until all 15 rounds were spent. I remember wondering if I was going mad. But the thought was fleeting as my eyes had never deceived me before. I don't meant to brag, but I'm good with a firearm. I can hit, target from a distance, even a moving one in most situ. Asians, I'm certain about my abilities, but neither every time I missed the target and splattered wood on the floor. It felt my confidence depleting for the first time in my life. If felt that death could be near, I was scared with my options depleted. I chose a direction and ran me boots made a considerable impact on the ground, but I swear I heard a second set of feet not too far behind me keeping up with my pace. Maybe it was an act of God, maybe it was luck, whatever it was, soon arrived at the locked gate that swallowed me into the forest. At the time, I barely questioned why it was open. Ned simply pushed through and continued towards the reception office and entered its walls after 46 minutes. My memory here gets a bit hazy, but I do remember that the building had its lights off. However, this was no concern for me after slamming through the front door. I jumped in my car and drove home. I wish I could end this story with a shocking plot twist or powerful life lesson. But this camping trip is as mysterious today, as it was the day I exited the forest if I didn't know any better. I would say that I briefly entered another dimension, but if I tell on you. Nethet ifir that they will have me locked up at the funny farm. If I'm being completely honest, this trip left me feeling alive more than I have been in a long time. I'm writing this with my bag packed in front of me, even though the website for the camping site has been taken down. I vividly remember the directions to its reception. I don't know what's going to happen, but I am sure of one thing. In particular this time, I will pay close attention to what the old man has to say. I still remember that summer camp trip vividly. It happened when I was in 8th grade in the beautiful lakeside city of Burlington, Ontario, not too far from Toronto. Our school had organized this trip kind of like a summer camp experience, and we were all eager to embark on this adventure. It was a Catholic school, and as part of our final year, all the 8th graders got a goon 2 trips. The first one usually took place in the fall, our religious camping trip, aimed at promoting Christian values and teamwork. To be honest, none of us were particularly excited about it. It felt like a never-ending religion class stretched over 3 days. The second trip, scheduled for spring, was supposed to be a weekend in Ottawa, exploring the city and visiting museums. However, our year took an unexpected turn when it was decided that we would go camping instead, 4 hours away at Algonquin Provincial Park. The camp was located near one of the park's lakes, set up like a typical summer camp with cabins scattered near the lake. And partially in the forest, there were separate buildings for bathrooms and a mesh shawl for those not familiar with provincia. L parks, they're similar to state or national parks in the United States. States, as expected, the boys and girls stayed in separate cabins. The girls' cabins were perched on supports above the ground and closer to the lake, while our cabins were nestled deeper in the forest along a gravel road. It shared our relatively large cabin with about 4 other guys. Or cabin, despite being the largest, was far from comforting, unlike the other cabins with proper windows and doors that could fully close and lock. Ours looked like it was hastily constructed from plywood. It had thin bug, screens for windows, and a door that wouldn't close properly. Now, I should mention that I had zero experience with axe camping. My family disliked it. This was a less than ideal first impression of the great outdoors. The creepiness began on the first evening. We were all gathered outside the mesh hall for a supposed fun night activity. The camp counselor spun a tale about a hermit who lived nearby in the woods, and we were going on a nighttime expedition to see where he resided. It was a random, intriguing idea, and it caught us by surprise with our flashlights as our only source of light. We ventured deeper into the dark woods, searching for this hermit's house. Excited screams echoed through the night as we hunted for the mysterious abode. Eventually, we stumbled upon the hermit's dwelling, which was nothing more than a massive log with a makeshift bed. After the eerie encounter, we were escorted back to camp. My group didn't see anything unusual, but other kids started whispering about glimpses of someone lurking in the dark woods. A person from my cabin then claimed to have seen blue glowing eyes in the darkness. I dismissed Tacit Campfire Ghost Story meant to spook us convinced that the person in the woods was just another counselor, but that night, everything changed sometime in the middle of the night. I was jolted awake by the sound of someone sprinting down the gravel road that ran to our cabin at first. It thought it might be an animal, but then I heard the faint crunch of gravel around our cabin. It was too soft for an animal. It was the sound of a person moving. Panics, etinas. I realized that our cabin door didn't lock, and the thin bug screen offered no protection if someone wanted to they co. LD easily pushed the door open and see inside my bed was right beside the door, and I kept my eyes locked on it, preparing to scream if someone entered, but the door never opened. The sound outside slowly faded away into the woods, leaving me terrified and baffled. My immediate thought was that it must have been the hermit. I ruled out the possibility of it being a counselor or teacher, as it was well past 3 in the morning, an odd time for a check-in. Surprisingly, I managed to fall asleep again after that ordeal. Unfortunately, that was the only interesting part of the camp trip. Their remaining days were marred by relentless rain, and some students from our class caught the flu from another school. Sharing the camp with us, the bus ride back home was partially quarantined. As time passed, I almost forgot about the creepy encounter, attributing it to the possibility of a counselor checking on us. However, the story didn't end there. The following year, it was my younger sister's turn to go on the same 8th grade camping trip. Just like for my class, they went on the strange hermit expedition during the first night. While she initially thought nothing of it, during one of the other days, she and a few friends ventured into the woods by the lake. She described seeing a small hermit-like person sitting on a log in the distance. It might not be the creepiest summer camp story ever, but it sends shivers down my spine, knowing that the hermit was indeed real, that seemingly fun-campled a bunch of children to a random guy's house in the middle of the woods, making the entire experience much less enjoyable in retrospect. It began with silence, so heavy, so complete, that I thought my ears had stopped working. Out there in the middle of the forest, where trees rise like old cathedrals and the canopy swallows sound, I stood still, listening. The air felt sharp against my skin, dry and brittle, as if the night itself wanted me to stop breathing. My flashlight beam cut across the ground in a weak cone, and for the first time since taking this job, I wondered whether the forest truly belonged to us, or if we were trespassers in something far older, something that didn't appreciate our presence. My name is Daniel Hale. I'm 39 years old, and for the better part of 2 decades, I've worked as a ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest of Montana. Most people think our work is simple, pointing out trails, warning about bears, maybe giving lost hikers a ride back to their campsites. They imagine clean uniforms and friendly advice at visitor centers. And yes, there's some of that, but that's not the job, not the real job. The real work starts when the forest takes someone. When a hiker vanishes without leaving a trace, when a hunter doesn't come back by nightfall, when the trail cameras capture things that don't belong to any animal we know, that's when we're sent in. That's when the wilderness shows its teeth. I learned that lesson in fragments, piece by piece, over years of patrols. At first, I chalked it up to bad luck, people making foolish choices, wandering off trails, underestimating the cold. But the longer I stayed, the more I began to notice the patterns, the way stories overlapped, the same descriptions whispered from different mouths, a shape in the trees, a sound that shouldn't exist, a feeling of being watched so strongly you could almost sense breath on your neck. And then, one night, I lived it myself. It was early fall, maybe the second week of October, when the first cold rains had swept through. I had been called out to check on a report of smoke rising near Copper Creek. The caller claimed they saw a small fire burning on a slope where no campsites were marked. With the dry season stretching longer every year, we didn't take chances. I geared up and drove the truck as far as the old service road would take me, then continued on foot. The rain had ended earlier that day, leaving the earth damp and slick. My boots crunched over patches of frost as I climbed. The sun had already dropped, and the forest carried that strange in-between light, neither day nor night, where everything feels thinner, like the world is stretched taut and waiting for something to rip through. I didn't see smoke, not a trace, But as I pressed higher into the trees, the smell of it came faintly through the air. Wood smoke. Sharp and sweet like cedar catching fire. I followed it, certain I'd find a smoldering campfire or maybe an abandoned site. Instead, I found the clearing. It was small, barely large enough for a tent or two. The ground was blackened, not by fire, but by something else, as though the soil itself had been charred long ago. In the center stood stones stacked in a rough ring like an old fire pit, but there was no ash, no wood, just the smell, thick, bitter, clinging to my throat. I crouched, running my fingers over the stones. They were cold to the touch. I swept the flashlight beam over the tree line, expecting to catch a reflection from an animal's eyes. Nothing. Just silence. Then came the sound. A knock, slow, deliberate, as if someone had taken a stick and rapped it against a tree trunk. 3 times. I froze. My first thought was a bear bluffing. They sometimes snap branches or make noise to warn you off, but this wasn't random. This was steady. A rhythm. 3 beats. Pause. Then again, 3 beats. I raised my radio to call it in, but stopped. The air had shifted. The smell of smoke thickened, wrapping itself around me. My instincts screamed to leave. And I'll admit, I almost did, but something kept me rooted, some mixture of duty and pride. This was my forest. My responsibility. I swept the beam again, wider, slower, until it caught movement. Something pale slipping between the trunks. Too tall for a man, too fast for a deer. The knock came again, louder now, closer. I backed toward the trail, every step deliberate, forcing myself not to turn and run. That's how people get lost. Panic blinds them, pulls them into the dark until the forest swallows them whole. When I finally reached the service road, the smell was gone. The silence broke with the distant cry of an owl. And for a moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined it all. But the next morning, when I returned with another ranger, the clearing was different. The stones were scattered, lying in the grass as if something had kicked them apart. And there in the mud was a single footprint, massive, wide, with toes that splayed unnaturally long. We didn't file a full report. Not officially. You learn quickly in this job that some things aren't meant to be written down. That was my first encounter, the one that cracked the door. After that, it became impossible to ignore the stories piling up around me. There was the Boy Scout who claimed he saw a face staring through his tent mesh, 8 feet off the ground. The woman who stumbled out of the forest, barefoot, muttering about the Watcher and refusing to ever camp again. The trail cameras that captured blurs, shapes that seemed human until you noticed the proportions were all wrong. I tried to rationalize it. I tried to tell myself these were coincidences, fabrications, the tricks of stress and exhaustion. But every time I returned to that clearing, I smelled the smoke again. Faint, but there. Always there. The second story etched deeper into me because this time I wasn't alone. We were searching for a missing hunter, a local man named Ray Jeffers, who knew the backcountry better than most. His wife reported him overdue by a full day, which was unusual for him. He was experienced, cautious. If something had gone wrong, we feared it was serious. 3 of us went out, me, a younger ranger named Collins, and a volunteer from Search and Rescue. We split into a fan pattern, moving slowly through the thickets. That was when we found his camp. The fire pit was still warm, embers glowing faintly. His pack was leaned against a log, untouched. But no sign of Ray. The ground around the site was torn up, grass pressed flat as though something heavy had circled. And then, hanging from a branch about 12 feet up, was his rifle. It dangled there by its strap, swaying gently in the wind. None of us spoke. None of us had to. Collins finally muttered, he couldn't have put it there himself. And he was right. The sight of that rifle swaying above us sent a cold current down my spine. I remember staring at it, watching the leather strap twist lazily, catching the dying light. My mind clawed for explanations. Maybe Ray had tried to hang it for safekeeping. Maybe he'd climbed the tree and dropped it accidentally. But none of those thoughts stuck. The branch was too high, the angle too clean. Someone or something had placed it there. The volunteer broke the silence first. Maybe he climbed, she said, though her voice faltered on the last word. I shook my head. With no pack, no shoes, and why leave everything else? Collins circled the tree, craning his neck upward. He was young, but not green. I could see him trying to swallow the unease, forcing himself into logic. We should mark the location, he said, and keep moving. He might not be far. We logged the coordinates, radioed the update, and pressed deeper into the woods. Each step felt heavier, as though the forest were shifting against us. The air grew cooler, and a faint mist began curling between the trunks. We kept our voices low, partly out of respect for the silence, partly because it felt wrong to break it. Then came the knocking. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker. Sharp, hollow strikes echoing through the trees. But the rhythm was wrong. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. The same cadence I'd heard weeks earlier at the blackened clearing. Collins glanced at me, his eyes widening. He heard it too. Could be another search group, the volunteer whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. No radios, no calls, I said. That's not them. The knocks came again, closer this time. The mist thickened, muffling sound, making it impossible to gauge direction. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but the thought of leaving Ray out there drove me forward. We moved in a line, Collins on my left, the volunteer behind. My flashlight beam swept the ground, catching roots, patches of moss, the glint of wet stone. Then it caught something else. A footprint. It was fresh, edges sharp, heel sunk deep into the mud. But it wasn't shaped like a boot. Not even close. It was longer, wider, the toes spread like a hand pressing into the soil. I crouched over it, my breath misting the air. Collins leaned in. That's not human. Could be a bear, I muttered, though even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. No bear track looked like that. The volunteer whispered, Then what is it? Before I could answer, a sound rippled through the mist. Low, guttural, like a growl carried on the wind. My chest tightened. It wasn't far. We regrouped quickly, deciding to follow the track. Every part of me resisted. Every instinct begged me to turn back. But that's the cruel thing about this job. You don't get to run. You don't get to look away. People depend on you. The prints led us down a slope, across a shallow creek, then up toward a stand of old pines. The mist clung to the ground, curling around our boots. My flashlight cut between the trunks, and that's when I saw it. Something pale and massive slipping just out of sight. I raised my radio. Base, this is Hale. We're tracking possible movement north of Jeffers' last camp. Coordinates. Static. I tried again. Nothing but a hiss. Collins cursed under his breath. Radios rarely failed out here, unless the terrain was extreme or something interfered. The growl came again, closer, vibrating through the ground. The volunteer gasped. Collins raised his rifle. Wait, I hissed. Don't. A branch snapped, sharp as a gunshot. We turned in unison, beams sweeping the mist, and then we saw it, a shape. Too tall for a man, shoulders broad, head brushing the lower branches. The beam caught the glint of pale skin, or fur, I couldn't tell. The mist distorted it, breaking the figure into fragments. But the eyes. God, the eyes. 2 burning points fixed on us, unblinking, filled with something that wasn't animal and wasn't human either. Collins raised his rifle again, but the thing moved, faster than I thought possible, slipping between the trees until the mist swallowed it whole. We stood frozen, hearts hammering, the silence pressing in again. The volunteer whispered, We need to go. But I shook my head. Not without Ray. We pressed forward, though every nerve screamed to retreat. We followed the last direction of the tracks until the ground opened into a small ravine. The mist pooled there, thick as smoke, and in the center, lying motionless against the rocks, was Ray. His body was twisted, his clothes torn. His what I could see of it was frozen in a look of sheer terror. His eyes stared wide, as though the last thing he saw had seared itself into him. But what stopped me cold wasn't his expression. It was his boots. They were gone. His feet were bare, raw with cuts, mud caked between his toes. Collins muttered, Jesus, then made the sign of the cross. The volunteer covered her mouth, stifling a sob. I crouched beside Ray, checking for any sign of life, though I already knew the answer. His skin was cold, his pulse absent. And there, beside his body, was another footprint. The same as before. Massive, inhuman, pressed deep into the soil. We radioed for recovery, though I doubted anyone would believe what we saw. The official report would say Ray fell, that he panicked, wandered, maybe tore his boots off in confusion. They'd chalk it up to exposure, disorientation. The forest has a way of erasing evidence, and the Bureau doesn't like stories that can't be explained. But I knew better. We all did. The ride back was silent. Colin stared out the window, pale and trembling. The volunteer kept wringing her hands, lips moving in silent prayer. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about Ray's eyes, wide, staring, reflecting something none of us could name. That night, I sat alone in my cabin, the wind rattling the shutters. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape in the mist, the pale shoulders slipping between trees, the eyes. Always the eyes. I tried to tell myself it was stress, a trick of light, of fear. But then came the knock, 3 beats. Against my cabin wall, I froze, every muscle locking. The lantern flickered. I waited, breath shallow. 3 more knocks. I gripped the edge of the table, sweat breaking across my skin. Finally, I forced myself to move, stepping toward the door. My hand hovered over the latch, but instinct screamed not to open it. The knocks came again, louder this time, then silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, straining to hear any movement outside. Nothing. When I finally opened the door, the porch was empty. The forest beyond was still, but on the dirt just beyond the steps was another footprint. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window with my rifle across my lap, watching the tree line until the first pale light of dawn spilled across the forest. My coffee had gone cold, untouched. Every creak of the cabin walls, every sigh of wind through the branches sent my nerves sparking. By sunrise, I was hollowed out, tired in a way that went deeper than muscle or bone. I reported for duty anyway. That's what Rangers do. We push through, keep the routine. But something had shifted in me. I wasn't just a protector of this place anymore. I was its witness, maybe even its prisoner. Collins wouldn't meet my eye that morning. He looked worn, older somehow. The volunteer had already filed to step back from future searches. I didn't blame her. People sign up to help the lost, not to face whatever that was. The official report on Ray came through 2 days later. Cause of death, accidental fall, exposure. No mention of the rifle in the tree, no mention of the footprints, no mention of his boots, just another neat file to stack away, another life folded into paperwork. But I knew the truth lived outside those pages, and I couldn't let it go. That's when the dreams began. Every night I'd see the same vision. The blackened clearing, the ring of stones, the smell of smoke clinging thick in the air, and in the shadows just beyond the fire pit something moved, something pale. Its shoulders hunched, its arms too long, its head tilted in a way that made my stomach churn. And always those eyes, fixed on me, unblinking. I'd wake drenched in sweat, the echo of 3 knocks still in my ears. Sleep became impossible. I started walking night patrols on my own, telling myself it was to clear my head. But deep down, I think I was searching. Searching for proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Searching for it. One night, about a week after Ray's body was found, I took the old North Ridge Trail. The moon hung low, swollen and yellow, bleeding light through the branches. My flashlight beam bobbed ahead, carving tunnels of vision through the dark. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Not even the owls called. I remember pausing at a bend where the trail narrows between 2 massive firs. The air felt colder there, as though I'd stepped into a cellar. My breath came in white clouds. I reached out and touched the bark of one tree, damp, slick with moss. That's when I smelled it. Smoke. Faint at first, then stronger. Sweet, bitter, clinging. My heart hammered. I lifted the light and swept it through the trees. The beam caught nothing but shadows. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps just off the trail. I froze. My hand tightened on the rifle. Who's there? My voice cracked, sounding foreign in the stillness. No answer. Another knock. Louder this time. I swung the beam and caught movement. A flicker of pale skin, gone in an instant. I should have turned back. I know that. but something pulled me forward, deeper into the trees, off the trail, and into the dark. Each step felt heavier, the ground soft with layers of needles. The smell of smoke thickened, burning the back of my throat, and then I saw the clearing, the same one as before. The stones were back, stacked in a perfect ring, though I knew we'd found them scattered after Ray. The earth inside the circle was black, as though burned, though no ash lay there. My light trembled in my hand. I stepped closer, drawn like a moth. The air vibrated, low and steady, like a hum beneath the ground. My chest tightened, my ears rang, and then I heard it, faint, almost like words. A voice, not loud, not clear, but whispering just at the edge of hearing. I spun, sweeping the light, but the clearing was empty. The forest pressed close, shadows bending against the beam. Then came the eyes. They appeared at the edge of the trees, two burning points fixed on me. The shape around them was massive, pale, hunched. My pulse pounded in my throat. "Stay back," I warned, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. The eyes only bored deeper, unblinking, like twin coals in the dark. I raised the rifle, my finger trembling against the trigger. My mind screamed to shoot, to end it. But some deeper instinct told me it wouldn't matter, that whatever stood there couldn't be stopped with bullets. The figure tilted its head, slow, deliberate, like a predator studying prey. Then it stepped back, vanishing into the trees without a sound. The whispering stopped. The hum died. The smell of smoke thinned. I was alone again. I don't remember walking back. My body moved on autopilot, one foot after the other, until I stumbled into the ranger station, shaking, pale as death. I told no one, not Collins, not my supervisor, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what would happen. They'd smile, nod, suggest time off, maybe a psychological evaluation. I'd be the ranger who cracked, the one who let the forest get to him. But the truth was heavier than silence. The next week brought more disappearances, a hiker gone missing near Elk Creek, a pair of campers who never returned to their car. The reports stacked, each one cutting deeper. And in every case, when I joined the searches, I smelled smoke. Always smoke. The others noticed too, though they didn't say it aloud. I'd catch Collins wrinkling his nose, glancing at me nervously. I'd see volunteers shift uncomfortably, sniffing the air, but none of them named it. None of them dared. The last straw came late one night when the station phone rang. It was a local trapper, his voice shaking, saying he'd seen something near the river. A pale figure, massive, watching him from across the bank. He swore it wasn't a bear, swore it wasn't a man. He begged us to send someone. I volunteered before anyone else could speak. Collins frowned. "You sure you want this one?" "I'll take it," I said flatly. The drive out was long, the road twisting through blackened pines scarred from an old wildfire. The river roared in the dark, swollen with meltwater. I parked near the trapper's cabin, but he was gone, packed up, left in such a hurry he hadn't even latched the door. The air was colder by the river. Mist curled over the surface, pale and shifting. I stood on the bank, scanning with the flashlight. The beam caught only water, rocks, the jagged line of trees beyond. And then across the river, the eyes appeared, burning, fixed, unblinking. The pale shape loomed just beyond the mist, taller than any man, broader than any bear. My pulse thundered in my ears. The knocks came next, 3 in rhythm, echoing across the water. And then, the voice. Clear this time, low, guttural, almost human. It spoke my name. Daniel. My skin crawled, my knees buckled. My own name carried on a voice that wasn't a voice, vibrating in my bones. I stumbled back, dropping the beam. When I raised it again, the mist swirled, the river rushed, and I was alone. But I knew it had been real. It knew me now. After that night, there was no denying it anymore. The forest wasn't just watching me. It was calling to me. I went through the motions at the station, filed reports, maintained trails, answered visitor questions. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, every sound made my skin crawl. Every shadow felt like a warning. The others noticed, though they didn't press. Collins avoided long conversations, his eyes darting away when mine lingered too long. The disappearances continued. The hiker near Elk Creek was never found. The camper's tent turned up shredded, their sleeping bags slashed open, but no bodies inside. Each search brought us back with nothing, just more questions and a sick knot of dread. And always I smelled the smoke. The dreams worsened too. I'd see the clearing, the stones, the pale figure crouched low, arms dragging along the ground, its face obscured by shadow. It never moved toward me. It only watched. And when I woke, the smell of smoke lingered in my cabin, as real as any fire. One morning, after a sleepless night, I found a note slipped under my door. No name, just a few words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Don't follow it into the caves. My stomach turned cold. I searched the station logs, questioned the others, but no one admitted leaving it. Collins swore he hadn't. The supervisor brushed it off as a prank, but I knew better. There were caves scattered throughout the bitter roots, lava tubes, limestone caverns, hidden systems carved by water over centuries. Most were unmarked, uncharted, dangerous. Locals whispered about them, the way children whisper about monsters under their beds. They said things lived in them, things not meant to see the light. And now the thing that haunted me was tied to them. It didn't take long before I was called to one. A group of climbers had reported strange noises near Bear Hollow, a remote gorge with a cave entrance most folks avoided. They claimed they heard voices echoing inside, though no one else was around. One swore he saw torchlight flickering deep in the rock, but when they investigated, there was nothing. I volunteered again. Of course I did. The hike out was long, the trail narrow and winding. The gorge yawned ahead, a wound in the earth, its walls jagged, its shadows thick. At the base lay the cave entrance, dark, gaping, swallowing light. The air changed the moment I stepped near it. Cold, heavy, damp with the scent of stone and something else. Something rotten. I crouched at the mouth, shining the beam inside. The tunnel sloped down, rough rock dripping with moisture. The smell grew stronger, sour and acrid, mixed with that same hint of wood smoke. My gut twisted. The note came back to me, "Don't follow it into the caves." But I couldn't stop. I pressed forward, the beam cutting a narrow path through the dark. My boots slipped on wet stone, my breath echoing back at me. Deeper and deeper, the tunnel wound until the air itself seemed to thicken. Then came the knock. 3 beats, echoing off the walls, bouncing until it felt like it came from everywhere. I froze, the beam trembling. Another knock, louder, closer. The tunnel widened into a chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. The ground was littered with stones arranged in circles, dozens of them, rough rings stacked and broken as though something had tried again and again to build a fire that never burned. And in the center, a pile of boots, dozens of them, torn, scuffed, waterlogged, men's boots, women's boots, children's boots, some new, some rotting with age. My chest seized. I stumbled closer, shining the light across the heap. Every missing person, every hiker, camper, hunter, their boots were here. I gagged, bile rising in my throat. My legs wanted to run, but my body locked. Then I heard it, the whispering. Low at first, then rising, filling the chamber. Words I couldn't understand, twisted and broken, layered over each other until it became a chorus. The beam swept the far wall, and that's when I saw them. Handprints, hundreds of them, pressed into the stone. Some small, some massive, the fingers long and splayed. They stretched high above where any human could reach, smeared dark as though burned into the rock itself. The whispering rose, echoing, overlapping. My head pounded. I dropped to my knees, clutching them, my light spinning wildly. And then, the eyes. At the far end of the chamber, high on the wall, 2 burning points opened in the dark, fixed on me. Daniel, the voice thundered, shaking the stone. My name stretched, distorted, vibrating through my bones. I scrambled back, slipping on wet rock, the beam flailing across the chamber. The boots shifted, tumbling with a dry leather whisper as though something had stirred them. The figure stepped forward. It was massive, shoulders hunched, arms long enough to drag across the ground. Its skin or fur was pale, almost glowing against the dark. Its face was a blur of shadow, except for those eyes burning, unblinking. I raised the rifle, hands shaking, my breath ragged. The thing tilted its head, studying me like a specimen. Then it moved. 1 step, slow and deliberate. The chamber groaned as though the rock itself strained against its weight. I pulled the trigger. The blast shattered the chamber, deafening. The recoil slammed into my shoulder. The muzzle flash lit the figure for an instant. Tall, gaunt, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, teeth gleaming like shards of stone, and then it vanished. The echo of the shot rolled through the tunnels, fading into silence. My light cut across empty rock. The eyes were gone. But the whispering lingered. I didn't remember leaving. One moment I was in the chamber, the next I was stumbling out into the night air, collapsing onto the moss at the cave mouth. The stars wheeled overhead, blurred through tears. My body shook uncontrollably. My lungs heaved. I should have reported it. I should have told someone, anyone. But how? Who would believe me? Instead, I walked back alone, the memory of that chamber carved into me, the boots, the handprints, the eyes. The next morning, Collins knocked on my door. He looked pale, hollow. "You smell it too, don't you?" he asked. I froze. "What?" "The smoke." He swallowed hard, eyes darting to the tree line. "It's following me now." And for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. Collins stood in my doorway, his face pale in the morning light. His uniform shirt was wrinkled, his collar half-buttoned, as if he hadn't slept or hadn't cared to. The dark rings beneath his eyes told me what I already knew. He was breaking down, just like I was. "I tried to ignore it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Told myself it was a campfire, that I was just tired. But last night, it came to my cabin." My pulse quickened. "What came?" "The knocking." He stared past me, his eyes unfocused. 3 times, just like you said. And then again, and again. I didn't answer. I just sat there, listening, waiting. When I finally opened the door, his voice cracked. There were footprints, not mine, not boots, bare, huge. I motioned him inside, shutting the door. The air between us was thick with unspoken fear. Neither of us needed to convince the other anymore. "They don't want us telling anyone," he said. "That's why the reports get scrubbed. Why the stories never match what we see. It's been happening for years, Hale. Longer than we've been here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, worn at the edges. He set it on my table. It was a photocopy of a report dated 1973. The details blurred with age, but the words leapt out. Subject found deceased, cause listed as exposure, body unclothed from the knees down, boots missing, multiple large prints surrounding site, report amended, details redacted. My hands trembled as I set it down. "Where did you get this?" "An old box in the archive, buried under years of maintenance logs." He leaned closer, his voice tight. "It's the same thing, Hale. The same as now. They've always been here. The weight of it pressed against me, heavier than stone. Whatever haunted these woods wasn't new. It wasn't a passing anomaly. It was part of this place, as old as the rock and trees. That night, Collins and I decided to stick together. If it came again, we'd face it side by side. We stayed in my cabin, lantern lit low, rifles within reach. The forest outside was a black ocean, silent but for the occasional creak of branches. Midnight came and went, the minutes dragging, each one tightening the knot in my chest. Then 3 knocks. Clear, deliberate, against the far wall. Collins flinched, my hand tightened on the rifle. Another 3 knocks, this time on the opposite side of the cabin. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching long across the walls. My breath hitched. Collins whispered, "It's circling us." The knocks came again, now on the roof. Slow, steady, like fists on the shingles. I rose, rifle in hand, and moved to the window. The beam of my flashlight cut across the trees, but the night swallowed it whole. Nothing moved, nothing but shadows. Then came the voice, low, guttural, crawling through the wood itself. Daniel Collins. It knew both of us now. Collins staggered back, shaking his head. No, 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 no. The knocks grew louder, pounding in rhythm, vibrating through the cabin walls. The lantern sputtered. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Don't open the door," I whispered. "No matter what." The pounding stopped. Silence crashed down, so heavy I thought my ears had ruptured. Collins and I stood frozen, rifles raised, listening to the weight of nothing. Then, from just outside the door, came a sound that froze my blood. Breathing. Slow, heavy, wet. It dragged in, dragged out, rattling against the wood. Collins mouthed a prayer, his knuckles white on the rifle. I forced myself to the peephole, though every nerve screamed not to. I pressed my eye against the glass. 2 burning points stared back at me. I recoiled so violently I knocked the lantern over. The cabin plunged into darkness. We fumbled with matches, shaking until the light returned. But the sound was gone. The breathing, the knocks, all of it. The forest outside was silent once more. Neither of us slept. By dawn, Collins looked shattered. He left without a word, his steps uneven. I wanted to call after him to tell him we couldn't face this apart, but my voice wouldn't come. Later that day, I found him at the station, pacing like a caged animal. He cornered me the moment I walked in. "I've been thinking," he said, eyes darting. "Maybe it's not the forest itself. Maybe it's something inside it. The caves. You said you went in? You saw it." I nodded slowly. "I saw something." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Then we have to end it. Burn it out. Collapse the caves if we have to." The desperation in his tone twisted my gut. He was spiraling. I could see it, but a part of me wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that this thing could be destroyed, that the boots and the handprints and the whispers could be silenced forever. We argued in hushed tones until the supervisor entered, forcing us to shut up. He eyed us suspiciously, no doubt hearing the strain in our voices. But he didn't ask. He never asked. That night I dreamed again. The clearing, the stones, the smoke. Only this time, Collins stood beside me. The pale figure loomed closer, its mouth stretching wide, wider, impossibly wide. And from its throat came the sound of knocking, each slam of its teeth echoing through the dream. I woke to find Collins gone. His cabin was empty, the bed unmade, his gear stripped down. The only thing he left behind was his radio, dead on the table. I checked the logs. He hadn't signed out, hadn't marked his route, but I knew where he'd gone. The caves. I grabbed my pack, my light, my rifle, and followed. The trail twisted through the dark, the trees leaning close as if listening. The smoke smell grew stronger with every step, stinging my eyes. My pulse thundered, but I pushed forward, the memory of the note screaming in my mind, "Don't follow it into the caves." But I had no choice. The mouth of the cave yawned ahead, darker than any night. Collins's footprints marked the mud, clear and fresh, leading straight inside, and behind them, pressed deep into the soil, were others, massive, bare, toes splayed wide. I tightened my grip on the rifle and stepped into the dark. The air inside was colder than the night itself, sharp and metallic, as though the cave exhaled from lungs older than the forest. My flashlight beam carved trembling slices through the dark, catching jagged stone and glistening threads of moisture. Each drip echoed far too loud, magnified by the cavern until it sounded like footsteps just behind me. Collins's boot prints stretched ahead, steady at first, then uneven, as if he had begun to stumble. Beside them, those other prints kept appearing, massive, barefoot, pressed deep into the mud. My gut twisted at the sight. They weren't just following him, they were guiding him deeper. "Collins!" My voice cracked as it shot through the tunnel. It bounced back at me, warped, carrying an edge that didn't belong to me. My own words didn't sound like mine anymore. No answer. Just the hollow groan of stone shifting somewhere deeper inside. I forced myself forward, every nerve screaming that I should turn back. The beam of light quivered against walls that seemed too close one moment and impossibly vast the next. The smell of smoke lingered here too, bitter and suffocating, though there was no fire. The prints led me to a narrow passage, barely wide enough for my shoulders. I squeezed through, the stones scraping against my uniform, the rifle awkward in my grip. The air pressed tighter, colder. At one point I had to crouch, my breath fogging in front of me. It felt like the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. Then the passage widened into a chamber, and I froze. Boots. Dozens of them, scattered across the floor like discarded offerings. Men's boots, women's boots, children's shoes even, worn down, mud-caked, some torn as if ripped from struggling feet. My flashlight flicked over them and my stomach heaved. Collins's boots lay among them, fresh, laces undone, tossed aside as though he had stepped right out of them. "Collins!" My whisper cracked in the damp air. A sound answered. Not words. Breathing. That same heavy, rattling breath I'd heard outside my cabin door. It came from the far side of the chamber, from a deeper blackness my light couldn't pierce. Daniel. My name slithered across the stone, lower than a whisper, but louder than a shout inside my head. I raised the rifle, my finger trembling on the trigger. Where is he? My own voice barely held together. A shuffle, movement in the dark. Then, a figure stepped into the beam. It was Collins. His eyes were wide, glassy, his chest heaving like he'd run for miles. But his boots were gone, his bare feet blackened with mud and blood. He stumbled toward me, arms outstretched. They told me to take them off, he rasped. His voice was not entirely his. Said I couldn't walk with them, said I had to be light, had to be free. Collins, listen to me, we have to get out of here. I took a step forward, but my flashlight wavered. Behind him, deeper in the dark, something shifted. Something too large to fit the space, moving with the scrape of bone on stone. Collins' head snapped toward it, as if answering an unheard call. His lips moved, whispering words I couldn't catch. Then, slowly, he began walking back into the blackness. No, I lunged, grabbing his arm. His skin was ice cold. He turned on me, eyes wild. You don't understand, Hale. You don't fight it. You join it. That's the only way it leaves you alone. His arm slipped from my grasp with inhuman strength, and he staggered into the dark. That was when I saw it. The light just barely kissed its outline, taller than any man, shoulders scraping the ceiling, arms hanging long enough to brush the ground. Its head was wrong, too elongated, the face stretched into shadow, and its eyes, two burning coals, fixed on me. I fired. The shot cracked like thunder in the chamber. The flash blinded me for a heartbeat, and the recoil nearly knocked me over. When the smoke cleared, the thing was gone. But Collins was gone too. I stumbled forward, shouting his name until my voice shredded. The footprints continued deeper, his small, frantic steps swallowed by those massive bare prints. I couldn't follow. Not then. My body shook so violently I thought my bones would rattle loose. I turned and fled, scraping through the narrow passage, my breath ragged, the smoke smell choking me. By the time I burst out of the cave, dawn was bleeding into the trees. The forest looked unchanged, silent, beautiful even, as if nothing had ever happened. But Collins was gone. I staggered back to the station, dirt-streaked, eyes wild. I wanted to tell the supervisor, tell the other rangers. But when I opened my mouth, no words came. The truth curdled inside me like poison. I could already see it in their faces if I tried. Disbelief, maybe even laughter. And worst of all, fear. So I said nothing. Collins' absence was marked in the logs. Unaccounted for, the supervisor wrote. Presumed transfer or desertion. No one questioned it. No one looked for him. But I knew. Every night since, I've dreamed of him. Of his bare feet slipping deeper into that cave, the voice guiding him into the dark. And I've dreamed of the figure that followed, its burning eyes fixed not on him, but on me. Sometimes when the wind is right, I swear I still hear the knocking. I didn't return to the caves. Not that week, not that month, not since. But they returned to me, in fragments, in dreams, in waking moments when my thoughts drifted too long into silence. I'd be filing a report or checking equipment in the shed, and the sound would slip back into my ears. The knock, deliberate and slow. 3 times, always 3. The others began to notice. "You're not sleeping," one of the younger rangers said to me one morning as we prepared for patrol. She meant it kindly, her tone soft, but the look in her eyes was wary. I didn't answer. The supervisor asked if I was fit for duty. I nodded, too quickly, the words "yes, sir" spilling from me before he could press further. I knew what he was really asking. Was I going to be a liability? Was I going to talk about what happened to Collins? I didn't. Collins' name wasn't spoken anymore, not around me, not around anyone. He became another ghost folded neatly into the park's long, quiet history of disappearances. His boots, his laughter, the way he hummed under his breath when he was nervous, those things lived only in my memory now. But the forest hadn't forgotten. On patrol one afternoon, I stopped to drink from my canteen. The trail was empty, the air heavy with the kind of silence that presses on your ears. Then I heard it, bare feet slapping against earth just behind me. I spun around, rifle half raised. Nothing. The trees leaned in, shadows stretching too long. I forced myself to keep walking, each step heavier than the last. That night in my cabin, I noticed mud smeared on my porch. Bare prints, human-sized. They led up to the door and stopped. I didn't sleep. Days bled together. I moved like a ghost among the others, completing my tasks, eating little, speaking less. But inside, the tension coiled tighter and tighter. I kept thinking about Colin's words in the cave. You don't fight it. You join it. I hated myself for wondering if he was right. One evening, the supervisor called me into his office. He shut the door and leaned forward on his desk, eyes sharp. You've been here a long time, Hale. You've seen more than most. I'm not asking you to explain, but I need you to listen. Whatever you think you've seen, whatever you believe, keep it to yourself, for your sake, for all of ours. There was no threat in his tone, just exhaustion, as if he had delivered the same warning to countless others before me. His silence was as heavy as the cave walls. I left his office with bile in my throat. The message was clear. The forest has its rules, and so does the service. We protect the land, not the truth. That night I dreamt of Collins again. Only this time, he wasn't stumbling into the dark. He was standing outside my cabin, barefoot, mud up to his shins. He smiled, lips cracked, eyes empty, and behind him, stretching tall and crooked, was the figure. Its arm rested on his shoulder, as if presenting him to me. I woke with my sheets soaked through. But worse than the dream was the smell. Smoke, thick, acrid, hanging in the air of my cabin as if a fire burned just outside. I bolted to the door, rifle in hand. The night was clear, the trees motionless, no fire, and yet the scent clung to me, seeping into my clothes, my hair. The knocking began again, this time from under the floorboards. 3. I froze, rifle pressed to my chest. 3 more. Louder. I staggered back, the cabin walls closing in. My pulse thundered so hard I thought it might burst from my throat. Then, silence. I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair until dawn, staring at the floor, waiting for the wood to break apart and spill open into darkness. The next morning, I found myself at the trailhead that led to the caves. My body moved without permission, my boots crunching over gravel, breath shallow. Part of me wanted to end it, to step back inside and confront whatever waited in the dark. Another part knew I wouldn't come back. That was when I noticed something carved into the signpost. Not initials, not dates. Words etched deep into the wood. Leave your boots. The letters were rough, as if scratched by stone, not knife. I stood there staring, my stomach hollowing. I should have reported it, taken a picture, logged the vandalism. But I didn't. I couldn't. I turned and walked away, faster, my throat dry. That night, I left my boots by the bed. I don't know why. I told myself it was coincidence, that I was just too tired to put them away. But when I woke, they weren't where I left them. They were at the door, and the mud on the porch was fresh again. I sat with my back to the wall, rifle in hand, heart thundering. I thought of Collins, of his bare feet echoing into the dark, of his voice when he told me the truth. That's the only way it leaves you alone. For the first time, I wondered if my boots would one day lie scattered in that chamber, among the others. And I wondered if, when they did, someone else would be sent to look for me, only to find the prints leading deeper. I started leaving the lantern burning through the night. It didn't help. The light only made the shadows sharper, stretching long fingers across the walls until I swore I saw them twitch. My ears never stopped straining for the sound, the knock, the scrape, the slow, wet breath. And then there were the whispers. At first, I thought they were dreams, fragments of Collins bleeding into my sleep. But then they came while I was awake. Faint murmurs curling through the air of the cabin, through the trees, beneath the sound of running water. Never clear. Never words I could repeat, but always directed at me. Always pulling. The boots kept moving. Each morning I'd find them closer to the door, even if I'd tuck them under the bed. Once I found them outside, neatly placed on the porch as if waiting for me to slip them on and walk. I locked the door every night after that. Still, the knocking came. 3. sometimes at the walls, sometimes at the roof, sometimes at the floor, but never random. Always a rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. And I realized something that made my stomach turn. It was training me, conditioning me, the way a predator tests the edge of a herd, circling, pressing, until the prey knows its fear more than its own body. The other rangers looked at me like I was unraveling. Maybe I was. My reports grew short, my words clipped. I avoided eye contact. I spent my shifts scanning the tree line instead of watching hikers. The supervisor pulled me aside to get me to take leave if I needed it, but I knew what leave meant. Time away from the station, alone, in the woods, exactly what it wanted. One evening, I couldn't take the cabin anymore. I walked the perimeter of the compound instead, boots heavy on gravel, my flashlight beam trembling. The woods pressed in from every side, the smell of pine thick in the air. That's when I saw it. A shape, half hidden behind the tree line. Taller than any man, pale against the bark. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It only stood there, watching. I lifted the light, and it vanished. I stayed frozen until my lungs burned. When I finally moved, it was straight back to the cabin, rifle clutched so hard my hands ached. I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Fatigue, stress, shadows in the branches. But when I reached the trailhead for patrol, my heart stopped. Carved into the dirt were fresh words, deep as if gouged with claws. Daniel. Just my name. Nothing more. The earth itself was calling me. I radioed in that the trail was clear, my voice hollow. Then I turned and walked the long way back, cutting through the brush just to avoid that sign. That night, the dream came again. Collins barefoot in the clearing, smiling with cracked lips. The figure beside him, its hand resting gentle on his shoulder like father and son. This time, Collins spoke. "Take them off, Hale. You can't run forever." When I woke, my boots weren't just at the door. They were outside, side by side on the porch, laces untied, waiting. And next to them, pressed deep into the mud, were prints, huge, bare. I locked myself inside, shaking, rifle in hand. The knocking began immediately. 3, 3, 3. All night until dawn bled pale through the window. I didn't move. The next days blurred. The forest's beauty, its tall pines, its bright creeks, its trails winding through golden leaves, was lost to me. All I saw were the shadows between the trunks, the places where something could stand, waiting. All I smelled was smoke. All I heard were knocks. It wanted me. And part of me wanted to give in. The boots at the porch, the whisper in the trees, by the memory of Collins. Every piece of it pressed at my will like water against rotting wood. I told myself I was strong, that I was a ranger, sworn to protect. But what good is protection when you can't even protect yourself? One evening, I found myself at the trailhead again. The signpost loomed, the gouged words faint in the daylight. My boots felt heavier than ever, each step an anchor. What if I left them? The thought slithered through me like venom. What if I set them down, just once, and walked barefoot into the dark? Would it stop? Would the knocking end? I stood there for too long, staring at my laces, my breath shallow, my fingers twitched toward the knots. Then a sound snapped me back. A scream. Faint, distant, echoing from the trees. Not a hiker's call, not an animal's cry. A man's scream, raw and tearing. Collins. I bolted into the woods before I could think. Branches whipped my face, roots clawed at my boots, but I didn't stop. The scream rose again, closer, then cut short like a blade to the throat. I burst into a clearing, lungs burning. Empty. But in the mud, fresh prints, bare, huge, leading toward the caves, and beside them, smaller ones. Boot prints. Collins's. I stared at them until my vision blurred, until my breath shook like leaves in the wind. He was alive. He had to be. But if he was alive, he was calling me back to the one place I swore I'd never return. The cave waited. The smoke thickened. And somewhere in the dark, something knocked 3 times. The prints shone in the mud like they'd been pressed only minutes ago, sharp edges still glistening with moisture. Collins's tread. I knew it by heart. The same boots I'd seen lined at the station, scuffed at the heel from years of use. My chest tightened. It had to be him, alive. But the larger prints dwarfed his, swallowed them as though walking in tandem. The thought, twisted my stomach. If Collins still lived, he wasn't walking alone. The trail bent toward the ridge where the trees thinned and the mouth of the cave waited like an open wound in the earth. The closer I came, the thicker the smell of smoke grew, acrid and clinging, until my throat felt lined with ash. My boots dragged heavy, the laces tugging as if they wanted to slip free of my feet. When the cave's shadow fell over me, I froze. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to leave Collins to whatever fate had claimed him. But his voice still rang in my head, the scream, desperate, raw. If there was even a chance, I forced myself inside. The air swallowed me whole, damp and cold, stone closing in from every side. My flashlight beam trembled across the floor, catching the familiar scatter of boots left behind by others who had entered but never returned. Their laces curled like dead snakes, and there, just ahead, Collins's boots again. Fresh, empty. My chest constricted. Collins? My voice cracked, weak in the cavern. Something answered. Not words, not a scream, a laugh. It echoed through the rock, bouncing, stretching, until I couldn't tell if it belonged to him or to something else entirely. I pressed deeper. The mud sucked at my boots, the passage narrowing until I had to crouch. The sound of dripping water fell in rhythm with my heartbeat. Then came the knocking. 3. It rattled the stone under my palms. 3 more. I spun, the beam darting across slick walls. Nothing. But the sound moved with me, always just ahead, pulling me deeper. The chamber opened suddenly, wide and hollow, the ceiling lost in shadow. My light caught movement, shapes at the edge of vision, bare feet shifting, pale limbs slinking back into the dark before I could focus. Then the beam found him. Collins. He stood barefoot in the center of the chamber, his face turned up toward the void above. His clothes hung loose, torn, smeared with dirt. His lips moved in soundless prayer. Collins! My voice tore from my throat. Desperate. His head snapped toward me. For a moment, relief flickered across his face. Then something else, a shadow crossing his features, hollowing his eyes. You came, he whispered. His voice was raw, trembling. I told you, Hale, you can't fight it. You have to let go. He lifted a hand, pointing toward the far wall. My beam followed. The figure stepped into the light. Taller than before, crouched low, shoulders scraping stone, its limbs bent wrong, too long, hands dragging against the ground. The face, if it could be called that, was a smear of pale flesh stretched tight, no eyes, no mouth, yet I felt its gaze sink into me. The knocking started again, this time from its chest. Deep, resonant, each thud vibrating through the chamber, through my bones. I raised the rifle, my breath sharp. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. Collins moved between us, his arms spread wide. No, Hale, don't. It won't matter. It never mattered. Get out of the way, my voice cracked. We can leave, both of us. Just come with me. You don't leave. His voice was calm now, eerily calm. You only join. The thing moved closer, each step booming through the stone. The chamber shrank around me, the air thick with smoke. Collins' eyes locked on mine, pleading, not for escape, but for surrender. My finger tightened on the trigger. For one heartbeat, I thought I saw the man I knew, Collins laughing by the fire, teasing me about my terrible cooking, humming under his breath on long hikes. Then the figure's hand fell onto his shoulder, the same way it had in my dreams, and Collins smiled. Something inside me broke. I fired. The shot ripped through the chamber, the recoil jarring my arm. Collins crumpled before the sound even faded. The figure recoiled, not in pain, but in surprise. Then it let out a sound that shook the stone itself, a low vibrating roar like the earth splitting apart. I ran. Boots pounding against mud, lungs tearing, the knocking chasing me through the tunnels. 3, 3, 3. Louder, faster, until it was all I could hear. My flashlight flickered, sputtered, then died, plunging me into black. But I kept running. The cave's mouth appeared ahead, faint light spilling through. I burst out, choking on smoke that wasn't there, collapsing onto the forest floor. The woods were silent. Morning light draped soft across the trees. Birds sang as if nothing had happened, but my boots were gone. I stared at my bare feet, caked in mud. Somewhere in the scramble through the chamber they'd been taken, slipped from me without my knowing. Behind me, from deep in the cave, came one final knock. 3. Then silence. I staggered to my feet, toes digging into the dirt. The breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. I knew I should head back to the station. I knew I should report. But instead I stood there, barefoot at the cave's edge, the forest pressing close, listening. And for the first time, I felt light. I walked barefoot through the forest, the soil cool and damp beneath my toes. Each step sank into the earth like it welcomed me, claimed me. The silence around me felt heavy, as though the birdsong I thought I'd heard earlier was only an echo, a trick meant to soothe. The boots were gone, my last tether. I should have turned back, should have stumbled to the truck, radioed for help, anything. But I didn't. I kept walking deeper, away from the road, away from the station, letting the undergrowth brush my ankles, thorns scratching at skin that didn't seem to bleed anymore. The knocking followed. Not behind me now, but within. A rhythm in my chest, my ribs resonating with each beat. 3, 3, 3. By the time I reached the ridge, the morning sun was breaking through the canopy, laying gold across the trees. I stopped there, breath shallow, and looked out over the valley. Smoke curled faintly in the distance where Collins and I had worked the line only weeks ago. I wondered if anyone else would notice it, if they would send crews again, or if they'd forget this patch of wilderness, let it burn itself into silence. Collins. I saw his face every time I blinked, saw his smile, not the one that had split in the chamber, but the real one. The one he'd offered me the first day we were paired. He'd known, somehow, what this place wanted, and he hadn't fought it, not at the end. I thought the guilt would crush me, but it didn't. The weight sat in me differently, like a stone smoothed by water. Heavy, yes, but almost fitting. The forest breathed. I sat at the ridge's edge, pulling my knees close, the dirt cool against my bare feet. My rifle lay heavy across my lap, but it felt useless now, no more threatening than a twig snapped underfoot. What was left to fight? The knocking deepened. Not loud, not painful, just constant. A new heartbeat, my heartbeat. I understood then. This job, ranger, guardian, whatever word they gave us, it was never about saving the forest, not really. Fires always came. People always disappeared. Boots always went missing. What mattered was the surrender, the giving over. Collins had been right. You don't leave. You only join. I thought about all the warnings I'd ignored. The stories of rangers who vanished, the legends whispered by locals, the abandoned boots scattered through the trees. Each of them had fought. Each failed. And here I was, the latest in the line, but maybe not the last. Someday another ranger will come. Another will hear the knocking, smell the smoke, find the boots. They'll follow, just as I did, pulled by duty or desperation. And maybe I'll be waiting. Maybe that's the lesson. I closed my eyes. The breeze stirred, carrying the scent of ash and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked and fell, its echo rumbling like distant thunder. The forest shifted around me, alive in ways I'd never seen before. Shadows moved without wind. Roots curled above ground like fingers. The soil breathed against my bare feet. And for the first time since I'd taken this post, I felt no fear. I let the rifle slip from my hands. It clattered softly against the stone, forgotten. I lay back on the ridge, arms spread wide, staring up at the canopy. Light fractured through the leaves, blinding and soft. The knocking in my chest steadied. 3. 3. 3. I thought of all the campers I'd warned over the years, all the visitors who'd passed through, never knowing what lay beneath the trails they hiked, the fires they built, the laughter they carried into the night. I thought of them and wondered if they'd ever feel it too. The pull, the hum, the weight of something older than smoke and ash. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe it was only us, the rangers. The ones who stayed too long. The ones who listened. I felt sleep press against me, heavy and sweet. My body sank into the soil, the earth softening beneath me, cradling me. The breeze carried a whisper I couldn't quite understand, but I knew the voice. Collins. I smiled. When I opened my eyes again, the world had changed. The ridge stretched wider, the valley below endless, the sky darker though the sun still shone. My skin gleamed pale against the dirt, veins thrumming with something thicker than blood. My feet bare, always bare now, had rooted into the soil, toes curling deep. I was no longer just Hale, no longer just a ranger. I was part of the forest. The knocking spread beyond my chest, resonating through the trees, through the ground, through the air itself. A rhythm older than fire, older than boots, older than men. Three, three, three. And in that rhythm, I finally understood peace.